On a rain-soaked night, a lonely widow opened her door to a stranger, cold, wounded, and desperate for shelter. She asked for nothing, offered him warmth, and let him rest by her fire. To her, he was just a broken man passing through. But days later, when a lawyer arrived at her doorstep with papers in hand, her world stood still, the deed to acres of land, signed in her name. The stranger she'd helped had given her everything he owned. The wind came first. It always did out here on the Wyoming plains, rolling across the frozen grass like something alive, something hungry. The kind of wind that didn't just push against the walls of a cabin, but pressed into them, testing every board, every nail, looking for weakness. The widow stood at her window, one hand steadying the frame as the shutters rattled against their hinges. Outside, the world had disappeared into white. Not the gentle white of Christmas stories or painted scenes, but the kind that erased everything. Fence posts, hills, even the memory of where the sky ended and the earth began. She turned from the window, her breath misting in the cold air inside the cabin. The fire in the hearth was struggling, its flames bending sideways each time the wind found a crack in the stones. She'd stuffed rags along the doorframe that morning, but already she could feel the cold seeping through, spreading across the floorboards like water. Her name was Eleanor Pritchard, though no one in town had called her by her first name in 3 years. Not since Samuel died. Now she was just the widow, spoken with either pity or suspicion, depending on who was talking. The ranch, if you could still call it that, sat 7 miles from the nearest neighbor, tucked into a valley that offered shelter from summer heat but became a trap when winter came early. And this winter had come early. Eleanor moved to the hearth, adding 2 logs from the dwindling pile beside the stone. The wood caught slowly, reluctantly, as if it too wanted to conserve its strength for the long night ahead. She straightened, pressing one hand to the small of her back where the constant work had settled into a dull ache. 42 years old, and some mornings she felt twice that. Samuel used to joke that the land aged you in dog years, 7 for every one. She hadn't found it funny then, now she understood. The wind screamed, not howled, screamed, a sound so sharp and sudden that Eleanor flinched, her hand going to her chest. For a moment she stood frozen, listening. Then it came again, and this time she realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was a voice. She moved to the door without thinking, her fingers already working the latch. The cold hit her like a fist when she pulled it open, stealing her breath, blinding her with snow. She raised one arm to shield her face, squinting into the storm. "Hello?" Her voice disappeared into the wind. She leaned forward, one hand gripping the doorframe, her eyes searching the white chaos. At first she saw nothing, then movement, a shape, darker than the snow, stumbling toward the cabin, not walking. Falling forward, catching itself, falling again. "Lord have mercy," Eleanor whispered. She stepped out into the storm, the cold biting through her dress and shawl like teeth. The snow was already past her ankles, drifting against the side of the cabin in waves. She could barely see 3 feet ahead, but she moved toward the shape, her boots crunching through the frozen crust. He collapsed before she reached him. One moment he was moving, the next he was face down in the snow, his coat dark with ice and something else. Something that looked black in the dim light. Blood. Eleanor dropped to her knees beside him, her hands fumbling for his shoulders. He was heavy, dead weight. And when she tried to roll him over, his head lolled back, his face gray beneath the frost clinging to his beard. "Can you hear me?" She had to shout over the wind. "Can you stand?" No response. His eyes were closed, his lips slightly parted. For a terrible moment, she thought he was already gone. Then she saw his chest rise, barely, but enough. Eleanor looked back toward the cabin. 40 feet, maybe less, but it might as well have been a mile. She got her arms under his shoulders and pulled. He didn't budge. She tried again, planting her feet, using her legs. This time he moved, sliding a few inches through the snow. She pulled again, and again. Her breath came in short gasps, her lungs burning from the cold. Somewhere behind her she heard a sound, a wet, labored breathing that wasn't coming from the man. She turned her head and saw the horse. It was on its side, near the fence, its legs bent at wrong angles, its dark eye reflecting the storm. Dead or dying. The snow was already beginning to bury it. Eleanor turned back to the man and pulled harder. It took her 10 minutes to drag him to the cabin. By the time she got him through the door, her arms were shaking and her dress was soaked through with melted snow and his blood. She kicked the door shut behind her, and the sudden absence of wind felt like a blessing and a curse. Blessed silence, cursed stillness. She could hear everything now. His breathing, shallow and wet. The fire, crackling weakly. Her own heartbeat, hammering in her ears. She pulled him closer to the hearth, then stood and moved quickly through the cabin, gathering what she needed. Blankets from the chest at the foot of her bed, one of them still smelling faintly of Samuel's tobacco. A basin of water from the barrel by the stove, though the cold had filmed it with ice she had to crack with her knuckles. Clean rags, torn from an old sheet. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, even as her mind raced. Who was he? Where had he come from? And why in God's name had he been riding through a blizzard? She knelt beside him again, working quickly to remove his coat. It was frozen stiff in places, and she had to peel it away from his skin. Beneath it, his shirt was torn and dark with blood. She cut it away with her sewing scissors, the fabric parting easily. The wound was on his left side, just below his ribs, a long gash that looked more like a knife cut than anything else. Not deep enough to have hit anything vital, but deep enough to bleed, and bleed he had. His whole side was painted red, the blood frozen in places, still wet in others. Eleanor worked in silence, cleaning the wound as best she could, pressing clean rags against it until the bleeding slowed to a seep. She'd done this before, stitched up Samuel more times than she could count, back when he was still alive and still stubborn enough to think he could fix a fence in a lightning storm or break a green horse without help. Her hands remembered the motions even if her heart hammered with the fear of it all. When the wound was bandaged, she turned her attention to the rest of him. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 35, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that might have been handsome under different circumstances. His hands were rough, calloused, the hands of a man who worked for a living. But his clothes, beneath the blood and the dirt, were better than a common drifter's. Not fancy, but well-made, practical. She wrapped him in Samuel's blanket, tucking it around his shoulders and legs. Then she sat back on her heels, staring at him in the firelight. The wind continued to howl outside, rattling the shutters, pressing against the walls. The cabin felt smaller somehow, crowded with the presence of this stranger. Eleanor stood and moved to the door, checking the rags she'd stuffed along the frame. They were already damp. She pressed them tighter, then turned to look at the man again. He hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound beyond that shallow, labored breathing. For a moment she considered going through his pockets, looking for some clue as to who he was, why he was here. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the memory of Samuel, who'd always said a man's pockets were his own business. Maybe it was simple decency. Or maybe it was fear of what she might find. Instead, she added more wood to the fire and settled into the chair by the hearth, her eyes fixed on the stranger. The night stretched ahead, long and uncertain. Outside, the storm raged on, burying the world in white. Inside, the fire danced and the stranger breathed, and Eleanor kept her vigil, waiting. Hours passed. The fire needed feeding. Her eyes grew heavy, but she didn't let herself sleep. Twice, she got up to check his breathing, pressing her fingers to his throat to feel the pulse there. Faint, but steady. The second time, her hand brushed against something in his coat pocket, something that crinkled like paper. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the pocket. Then, slowly, she reached in and pulled it out. It was a letter, folded once and stained with blood. The ink had run in places, blurring the words, but she could still make out the address on the front. Her breath caught. The letter was addressed to Henry Blackwood, care of the Bitter Creek Mining Company. Henry Blackwood. She knew that name. Everyone in the territory knew that name. A ruthless man, they said. A man who'd made his fortune stepping on the backs of smaller folks, buying up land when ranchers couldn't pay their debts, using the law when it suited him, and ignoring it when it didn't. Samuel had dealt with him once, years ago, over a water rights dispute. It hadn't ended well. Eleanor stared at the letter, her mind spinning. Why would this man have a letter addressed to Henry Blackwood? Was he one of Blackwood's men, or was he running from him? She turned the letter over, looking for more clues, but found none. Just that name, written in neat, formal script, and a seal on the back. Broken now, the red wax crumbled into fragments. She carefully refolded the letter and tucked it back into his coat, her hands trembling slightly. Outside, the wind began to ease. Not much, but enough that the rattling of the shutters became less frantic. Eleanor glanced toward the window. Dawn was still hours away, but the storm was passing. She could feel it in the way the cold shifted, the way the silence between gusts grew longer. She looked back at the stranger. In the firelight, his face seemed less gray, more alive. His breathing had deepened, evened out. Whatever had brought him here, whatever he was running from or toward, he would live through the night. She'd made sure of that. But as Eleanor sat there, watching him breathe, watching the flames dance across his face, she felt something shift inside her, something she hadn't felt in 3 long years. Not curiosity, though that was part of it. Not fear, though that was there too. It was something older, something quieter. The sense that her life, which had narrowed to the size of this cabin and the chores that filled her days, had just opened up again. Not wider, exactly. Deeper, like a door she'd thought was sealed shut had cracked open, letting in a sliver of light from a room she'd forgotten existed. She didn't know his name, didn't know where he'd come from or why he'd been riding through a blizzard with a knife wound in his side and a letter to Henry Blackwood in his pocket. But she knew this. Nothing would be the same after tonight. The storm had brought him here, dropped him at her door like a question she didn't know how to answer. And somewhere in the silence of that frozen night, as the wind finally began to die and the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, Eleanor understood that mercy was rarely simple. It came with weight, with consequence, with questions that might never be answered. The stranger stirred once, just before dawn, a small movement, his hand twitching beneath the blanket. Eleanor leaned forward, holding her breath, but his eyes didn't open. He sighed, a sound so soft it was almost nothing, and settled back into sleep. Outside, the snow stopped falling. The world grew quiet, blanketed and hushed, as if holding its breath. And in that stillness, Eleanor sat beside the fire, wrapped in her shawl, watching over a man whose name she didn't know, wondering what price she'd just paid for the simple act of opening her door. The storm had passed, but inside the cabin, something else was just beginning, something that would test every belief she'd ever held about right and wrong, about trust and fear, about the space between survival and grace. She didn't know it yet. As she sat there in the growing light, her eyes heavy but her heart strangely awake. Didn't know that the man breathing softly beside her fire would change everything. Her land, her name, her understanding of what it meant to be alone in the world. But she would learn. The wind had stopped, the snow had settled, and when morning finally came, cold and clear and merciless, his eyes would open for the first time. And so would the questions buried in her heart. The morning light came thin and colorless through the window, turning everything inside the cabin into shades of gray. Eleanor woke with a start, her neck stiff from sleeping in the chair, her body folded at an angle that sent pain shooting down her spine. For a moment she couldn't remember why she was sitting by the hearth instead of in her bed. Then she saw him. He was still there, still wrapped in Samuel's blanket, but something had changed. His chest rose and fell with more strength now, and the gray pallor had left his face. In the daylight, she could see him more clearly, the lines around his eyes, the scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the way his jaw was set even in sleep, as if braced against something. Eleanor stood slowly, her joints protesting, and moved to the window. Outside, the world had been remade. Snow covered everything. The fence, the barn, the small corral where she kept the chickens. It lay smooth and untouched, broken only by the shape of the dead horse near the fence line, already half buried. She'd have to deal with that soon. Couldn't leave it there. But the thought of going out into that cold, of digging through frozen earth or dragging the carcass away, made her bones ache. Behind her, she heard a sound, a sharp intake of breath. She turned quickly. The stranger's eyes were open. They were gray, she noticed, the color of smoke, or storm clouds, or the ashes left behind after a fire burns itself out. He stared up at the ceiling for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then his eyes moved, slowly, taking in the cabin, the rough-hewn beams, the stone hearth, the shelf with its few books and dishes. When his gaze finally found her, standing by the window with the morning light behind her, he went very still. Neither of them spoke. Eleanor felt her heart beating in her throat. She didn't know what she'd expected, gratitude maybe, or questions. But he just looked at her with those smoke-gray eyes, and she had the strangest feeling that he was measuring her, weighing something she couldn't name. Finally he spoke. His voice came out rough, barely more than a whisper. "Where am I?" "My home," Eleanor said. She was surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. 7 miles south of Bitter Creek. "You collapsed outside my door last night during the storm." He closed his eyes, and she saw his jaw tighten. For a moment she thought he might pass out again, but then he opened his eyes and tried to sit up. The movement cost him. She saw the pain flash across his face, saw his hand go instinctively to his side where the bandage pressed against the wound. "Don't," Eleanor said sharply, moving toward him. "You've been hurt. You need to lie still." He ignored her, pushing himself up until he was half sitting, propped against the stone base of the hearth. His breathing came hard, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. But he stayed upright, one hand pressed to his side, his eyes now fully alert and focused on her. "How bad?" he asked. "Bad enough. Knife wound, looks like. You lost a lot of blood." His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or memory. He looked down at the blanket wrapped around him, at his bare chest beneath the bandage. "My clothes. I had to cut your shirt away to tend the wound. Your coat's there." She gestured to where she'd laid it across the back of a chair to dry. "I didn't go through your things," she added, though that wasn't entirely true. The letter was still there, she knew, folded in the inside pocket. She wondered if he knew she'd seen it. He nodded slowly, then looked toward the window. "The storm? Passed around dawn. My horse?" Eleanor hesitated. "Dead. Near the fence. I'm sorry." He absorbed this with the same stillness he'd shown since waking. No visible emotion, no reaction she could read. He simply nodded again, as if he'd expected as much. Then he looked back at her, and for the first time, she saw something that might have been gratitude in his eyes. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "I did what anyone would do." "No." His voice was firm despite its roughness. "You didn't. Most people would have let me freeze." Eleanor didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Instead, she moved to the stove and began preparing breakfast. Cornmeal mush and the last of yesterday's coffee, reheated and bitter but hot. She could feel his eyes on her as she worked, watching her movements with that same measuring quality. It made her self-conscious, in a way she hadn't felt in years. When the food was ready, she brought him a bowl and a spoon. He took it with hands that shook slightly, but his grip was firm enough. She watched as he ate slowly, carefully, like a man who knew his body needed fuel but wasn't sure it would stay down. After a few bites, he paused. "What's your name?" he asked. "Eleanor Pritchard. Mrs. Pritchard. Widow Pritchard." She didn't know why she corrected him. The distinction seemed important somehow. He nodded, then took another bite. When he'd finished about half the bowl, he set it aside and leaned back against the hearth, his face drawn with exhaustion. "Thank you, Mrs. Pritchard. For the food, for everything. You're welcome." She collected his bowl, then stood there awkwardly, unsure what to do next. "What's your name?" He hesitated. It was only a fraction of a second, but she noticed it. "Caleb," he said finally. "Caleb Thorne, Mr. Thorne." She nodded. "Do you have people I should contact? Someone who'll be worried about you?" "No," he said, perhaps too quickly. "No one." Another lie, she thought. Or at least not the whole truth. But she didn't press. Instead, she moved back to the window, looking out at the snow. "The road to town will be impassable for days. Maybe a week or more, depending on how the weather holds. You'll need to stay here until you're strong enough to travel and the road's clear." She heard him shift behind her. "I don't want to impose." "You don't have much choice," Eleanor said, turning to face him. "You can barely sit up, let alone ride, and even if you could, you don't have a horse. So unless you plan to walk 20 miles through waist-deep snow with a hole in your side, you'll stay." He studied her for a long moment, and she thought she saw the ghost of a smile touch his lips. "Yes, ma'am." The day passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Eleanor went about her chores, feeding the chickens, checking the barn, bringing in more firewood, while Caleb slept fitfully by the hearth. Each time she came back inside, she found herself glancing at him, checking to make sure he was still breathing. She told herself it was practical concern, nothing more. But there was something else there, too. Something she didn't want to examine too closely. By late afternoon, he was awake again and insisting on sitting up properly. She helped him move to the chair, the same one she'd spent the night in, and wrapped him in the blanket. He watched as she prepared a simple supper of beans and salt pork, his expression thoughtful. "How long have you been out here alone?" he asked. Eleanor stirred the pot without looking at him. 3 years? Your husband? Pneumonia. Took him fast." She kept her voice even, matter of fact. It had been 3 years after all. The grief had dulled to something she could carry, like an old injury that ached in bad weather but no longer brought her to her knees. "I'm sorry, so am I." She ladled beans onto 2 plates and brought one to him. This time his hands were steadier. "What about you, Mr. Thorne? What brings a man out into a blizzard with a knife wound in his side?" He took a bite of beans, chewing slowly. When he finally answered, his voice was careful. "Bad luck, mostly." "That's not much of an answer. It's the only one I have." Eleanor sat down across from him with her own plate. The fire crackled between them, the only sound in the cabin besides the clink of spoons against tin. She watched him eat and wondered what he was running from, or who. The letter in his coat seemed to burn in her mind, that name written in neat script, Henry Blackwood. "The men who did this to you," she said quietly. "Will they come looking?" He stopped eating, set down his spoon. When he looked at her, his eyes were hard. "Maybe. And if they do, then I'll leave before they get here. I won't bring trouble to your door, Mrs. Pritchard." "You already did," she said, "the moment you collapsed outside it." He had no answer for that. They finished their meal in silence, the weight of unspoken things settling between them like snow. That night, Eleanor insisted he take the bed while she slept in the chair. He protested, but she wouldn't hear otherwise. "You're the one who's been stabbed," she said firmly. "I've slept in worse places." It wasn't entirely true, but she wouldn't have slept well anyway, not with a stranger in her home, not with all these questions circling in her mind. She wrapped herself in a quilt and settled by the dying fire, listening to the sound of his breathing from the other room. Slow, even. The breathing of someone who'd learned to sleep light, ready to wake at the smallest sound. She understood that kind of sleep. She'd learned it herself, after Samuel died, when every creak of the cabin made her heart race, made her wonder if it was the wind, or something else, someone else. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, not comfortable exactly, but manageable. Caleb's strength returned slowly, and with it came a stubborn insistence on helping. On the second day, she found him trying to split firewood with one hand pressed to his side, his face white with pain. "Stop!" she commanded, taking the axe from his hand. "You'll tear those stitches open." "I can't just sit here," he said through gritted teeth. "Let me do something. You can rest. That's something." But he couldn't, she realized. He was a man built for motion, for purpose. Sitting still made him twitchy, restless, so she gave him small tasks, mending a bridle, sorting through the tack in the barn, sharpening kitchen knives. Things he could do sitting down, things that wouldn't tear him open but would keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. She caught him sometimes, in unguarded moments, staring into the fire with an expression so heavy with something, regret, maybe, or grief, that she had to look away. She wanted to ask what haunted him, but the words wouldn't come. They'd established an unspoken agreement. She wouldn't pry into his past, and he wouldn't offer it. It was safer that way, simpler. But nothing about this situation was simple. On the 4th day, she came in from feeding the chickens to find him standing by the window, wearing Samuel's old coat. She'd washed it and laid it out to dry the day before, and he must have found it. The sight of it, of him in Samuel's coat, standing in Samuel's spot by the window where her husband used to watch the sunrise, hit her like a fist to the chest. He turned when he heard her, and something in her face must have shown because he quickly moved to take the coat off. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "No," Eleanor said, her voice catching. "It's fine. You need a coat. That one's just sitting there." He looked at her for a long moment, the coat still half off his shoulders. Then he nodded and slipped it back on, fastening the buttons slowly. "Thank you." She turned away, busying herself with putting away the egg basket, blinking back tears she didn't want him to see. It was just a coat, just cloth and buttons. But it had been Samuel's, and seeing someone else wear it felt like watching the last piece of her old life slip away. "Mrs. Pritchard," Caleb said quietly. She didn't turn around. "I know this is hard, having a stranger in your home, wearing your husband's things. If there was any other way—" "There isn't," she said, her voice firmer now. "So we make do." That night, as they sat by the fire after supper, he finally spoke more than a handful of words. Not about himself, not about where he'd come from or where he was going, but about small things, the way the snow looked different here than in Montana, where he'd spent time years ago, the barn cat he'd seen, skinny and wary, that wouldn't let him near, the quality of her coffee, which he said was better than any he'd had in months. Eleanor found herself almost smiling. "It's terrible coffee, Mr. Thorne. You don't have to lie to be polite." "I'm not being polite," he said. "I'm being honest. You should taste the swill they serve in Bitter Creek." "I've tasted it." "You're right. Mine is better." He did smile then, a small thing, barely there, but it changed his face, softened the hard lines around his mouth. For a moment, he didn't look like a man running from something. He just looked tired. "Can I ask you something?" Eleanor said. His smile faded. "You can ask. The men who hurt you, were they from Bitter Creek?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Some of them. And Henry Blackwood?" The name escaped before she could stop it. "Does he have something to do with this?" Caleb's entire body went rigid. His eyes locked onto hers, sharp and suddenly dangerous. "How do you know that name?" Eleanor's heart hammered. She'd said too much, but there was no taking it back now. "I saw the letter," she admitted, "in your coat, that first night. I didn't read it, but I saw who it was addressed to." He stood abruptly, wincing as the movement pulled at his wound. For a moment she thought he might shout, might rage at her for invading his privacy, but he just stood there, his back to the fire, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "You should have left me in the snow," he said quietly. "Why?" "Because Blackwood's name is poison. Anyone connected to it, anyone who even knows it, ends up with blood on their hands or dirt on their grave." He turned to face her, and his eyes were full of something that looked like warning. "If his men come here looking for me, you tell them you found me dead. You buried me out past the ridge. You tell them whatever they want to hear, and you send them away. Do you understand?" Eleanor stood too, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I understand that you're afraid of him, but I've dealt with Blackwood before, Mr. Thorne. He doesn't scare me." "Then you're a fool." The word hung in the air between them, sharp and ugly. Eleanor felt her face flush with anger, but she kept her voice level. "Maybe I am, but I'm a fool who saved your life, so you'll show me some respect in my own home." They stared at each other across the firelight, two stubborn wills locked in silent conflict. Then, slowly, Caleb's shoulders dropped. The fight went out of him like air from a punctured skin. "You're right," he said. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Eleanor nodded stiffly and sat back down. After a moment he did the same. The fire crackled. Outside the wind picked up again, whistling through the eaves. Winter wasn't done with them yet. "I worked for him," Caleb said suddenly, his voice low. 3 years ago, before I knew what kind of man he was. By the time I figured it out, I knew too much. And men who know too much about Henry Blackwood don't tend to live long. What did you know? Things that could destroy him. Things that would see him hanged if they ever came to light. He stared into the fire. "I tried to run. Made it as far as Colorado before they caught up with me. That wound in my side? That was their way of sending a message. Next time, they won't miss." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Why were you coming back here then? Why ride toward Bitter Creek if you're running from Blackwood?" Caleb looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something she recognized, the desperate determination of a man with nothing left to lose. "Because I'm done running. I have evidence, papers that prove what he's done. I was bringing them to the federal marshal. If I can just get to him before Blackwood's men get to me. And if you can't, then it doesn't matter where I die. Here or there or anywhere." He looked down at his hands. "At least I tried." Eleanor didn't speak for a long time. She thought about Henry Blackwood, about his reputation, about the way Samuel's voice had shaken with anger the one time they dealt with him. She thought about the dead horse outside, about the blood she'd washed from this man's skin, about the letter folded in his coat. She thought about right and wrong, and the space in between where most people actually lived. "The marshal comes through, sometimes," she said finally. "Once a month, usually, checking on the outlying homesteads. He's due soon." Caleb looked up sharply. "How soon? Week, maybe 2, depending on the roads." She saw hope flicker in his eyes, fragile as a candle flame. "If I could stay until then." "You'll stay," Eleanor said firmly, "until you're healed and until the marshal comes. After that, it's out of my hands." "Mrs. Pritchard, Eleanor," she said. She didn't know why. Maybe because they'd moved past formality now, crossed some invisible line into something more complicated than stranger and host. "My name is Eleanor." He nodded slowly. "Caleb," he offered in return, though she already knew. They sat in silence after that, watching the fire burn down to embers. Outside, the night pressed close, and somewhere in the darkness, Eleanor thought she heard the howl of a wolf. Or maybe it was just the wind playing tricks. It was hard to tell, this far from everything, in the deep grip of winter. But inside the cabin, something had shifted. Trust, maybe, or at least the beginning of it. They were no longer just a widow and a stranger. They were two people bound together by circumstance and choice, by mercy and desperation, by the fragile hope that sometimes justice could outrun revenge. And as the fire finally died and Eleanor rose to bank the coals, she thought about the letter in his coat, about the name Henry Blackwood, about the way the world had a habit of bringing its troubles to her door. The snow kept falling, soft and relentless, burying everything. The sun came back on the 7th day. Not strong, not warm, but present. A pale disk behind thin clouds that turned the snow from blue-white to something almost golden. Eleanor stood on the porch, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, and watched the light spread across the valley. It had been so long since she'd seen anything but gray that the sight of it made her chest ache. Behind her, she heard the cabin door open. Caleb stepped out, moving carefully, one hand pressed lightly to his side, out of habit more than pain now. The wound was healing well, better than she'd expected. In another week, maybe 2, he'd be strong enough to ride, if he had a horse. "Morning," he said, his breath misting in the cold air. "Morning." She didn't look at him, just kept her eyes on the horizon where the sun was climbing. Road's probably still bad, but it's melting. Give it a few more days of this weather, and someone might make it through. He came to stand beside her, not too close, but close enough that she could feel his presence like heat from a fire. They'd developed this careful distance over the past few days, close enough to share space, far enough to maintain the boundaries. Neither of them had spoken aloud, but both understood. "The fence is down in 2 places," Caleb said, nodding toward the western pasture. "Noticed it yesterday. And the barn door's hanging crooked." "I know." Eleanor's voice was flat. She knew about the fence, about the door, about the loose boards on the north side of the cabin, and the way the chicken coop's roof sagged under the weight of snow. She knew about all of it, and hadn't had the strength or the time to fix any of it. Samuel had always handled those things. After he died, she'd done what she could, but some repairs required 2 sets of hands, or a man's strength, or skills she'd never learned. "I could fix them," Caleb offered quietly. "You're not well enough. I'm well enough to swing a hammer. And I owe you more than I can ever repay, but I'd like to start somewhere." Eleanor finally turned to look at him. The morning light caught the gray in his hair, the lines around his eyes. He looked tired still, but steadier, stronger. The haunted look that had lived in his face that first week was fading, replaced by something that resembled peace, or maybe just exhaustion that had finally found a place to rest. "All right," she said, "but you take it slow. If you tear those stitches, I'm not sewing you back together again." The corner of his mouth lifted. "Yes, ma'am." They worked through the morning, though work was generous. Mostly Eleanor worked while Caleb did what he could without straining. She showed him where the tools were kept in the barn, helped him carry lumber from the stack behind the cabin. He moved carefully, deliberately, testing his limits without pushing past them. The fence came first. 2 sections had collapsed under the weight of snow and wind. The posts rotted at the base. They'd need replacing come spring, but for now Caleb managed to prop them up and reinforce them with wire and spare planks. Eleanor held the boards steady while he hammered, their breath mingling in the cold air, their hands sometimes brushing as they worked. She tried not to notice those moments, the accidental touches, the way his voice rumbled low when he asked her to hand him a nail, the competent sureness of his hands as he worked. Tried not to notice, because noticing meant acknowledging something she wasn't ready to name. By noon, they'd finished the fence and moved on to the barn door. The top hinge had pulled loose from the frame, leaving the door hanging at an angle. Caleb studied it for a long moment, then nodded to himself. "I'll need to take the door down to fix this properly," he said. "Can you help me lift it?" Together they worked, the door free, Eleanor supporting the weight while Caleb loosened the remaining hinges. The door was heavier than it looked, solid oak that Samuel had installed when they'd first built the barn. Eleanor's arms shook with the effort of holding it, but she didn't let go until Caleb had it secured, and they could lower it safely to the ground. "You're stronger than you look," he said, not quite smiling, but something close to it. "I've had to be—" He held her gaze for a moment, and she saw understanding there. Not pity, she would have hated that, but recognition. He knew what it meant to survive on your own, to become hard in the places where life pressed hardest. They worked through the afternoon, stopping only when Eleanor insisted they eat something. She'd made Johnny cakes that morning, and they ate them cold with butter and the last of the honey, sitting on the porch steps in the weak sunlight. The valley stretched out before them, white and still, beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are. "It's quiet here," Caleb said, breaking the silence. "Peaceful. Lonely," Eleanor corrected. "There's a difference. I suppose there is." He took another bite of Johnny cake, chewing thoughtfully. "You ever think about leaving, moving into town?" "Every day, especially in winter." She wrapped her arms around her knees. "But this was Samuel's dream, our dream once, to build something that would last, something we could pass down. And then he died, and I thought about selling, about going back east where I have family, but I couldn't make myself do it. Couldn't let go of the last piece of him I had left." "That's not weakness," Caleb said quietly. "Holding on, isn't it? When you're holding on to something that's already gone." He was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "I held on to things once, people, places, a life I thought I'd have. Held on so tight I couldn't see when they slipped through my fingers anyway. Now I don't hold anything. Easier that way, is it?" Eleanor looked at him. "Easier?" He met her eyes, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of shared grief, of the different ways people survived loss. "No," he admitted, "but it's what I know how to do." The sun was starting to sink toward the horizon, turning the snow pink and gold. Eleanor stood, brushing crumbs from her skirt. "We should finish the door before dark." They worked side by side as the afternoon faded into evening, Caleb drilling new holes for the hinges while Eleanor held the lantern. By the time they lifted the door back into place, testing its swing, full dark had fallen and the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. But the door hung true now, closing properly, keeping the cold out and the animals safe. "Good work," Eleanor said, latching it shut. "We make a decent team." Caleb's voice was light, but there was something underneath it, a question maybe, or an observation he wasn't sure he should make. Eleanor didn't respond, just headed back toward the cabin, her boots crunching through the frozen snow. Behind her she heard him follow, heard him pause to stamp his feet clean before coming inside. The cabin felt warm after the cold outside, the fire she'd built that morning still burning low in the hearth. Eleanor added wood, building it back up, while Caleb hung their coats by the door. They moved around each other with an ease that hadn't been there a week ago, a rhythm that came from shared space and shared purpose. Dinner was simple, beans again and cornbread and bitter coffee. But they ate in comfortable silence now, the kind that didn't need filling with words. When the dishes were washed and put away, Eleanor took up her mending, a basket of it that seemed to never empty, while Caleb sat across from her, reading from one of Samuel's old books by lamplight. It was a scene that could have been domestic, could have been mistaken for something ordinary if you didn't look too closely, if you didn't notice the way Caleb's hands sometimes drifted to his side where the wound was healing, if you didn't see the sadness that lived in the corners of Eleanor's mouth when she thought no one was watching, if you didn't feel the weight of all the things unsaid that hung in the air between them like smoke. "Eleanor," Caleb said suddenly, looking up from his book, "can I ask you something?" She looked up from her mending. "You can ask. Why did you help me? That first night, you didn't know me, didn't know if I was dangerous, if I'd bring trouble. You could have left me out there. It would have been safer." Eleanor set down her needle and thread, considering the question. She'd asked herself the same thing more than once over the past week. "I don't know," she said finally. "Not entirely. Maybe it was just that I couldn't stand by and watch someone die when I had the power to help. Maybe it was because I know what it's like to need help and not have anyone to give it. Or maybe," she paused, searching for the right words, "maybe it was because I was tired of being alone with my grief, and saving you gave me something else to think about. Something other than the past." He studied her face in the lamplight, his expression thoughtful. "I'm grateful, whatever the reason. I know." She picked up her mending again, threading the needle through worn fabric. "But gratitude has a cost too, doesn't it? You're bound to me now, in a way, and I'm bound to you. Whatever happens when those men come looking, or when the marshal arrives, we're both going to have to live with the choice I made that night." "Are you sorry?" Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him, at the man who'd collapsed on her doorstep half frozen and bleeding, who'd woken up weary and wounded, who'd slowly, carefully, become something more than just a stranger seeking shelter. She thought about the past week, about the way the cabin felt less empty with him in it, about the sound of his breathing, at night, steady and alive. About the way he'd looked at her this morning on the porch, like she was something worth seeing. "No," she said quietly. "I'm not sorry." Something shifted in his eyes. Relief, maybe, or gratitude, or something deeper that neither of them was ready to name. He nodded once, then went back to his book, but Eleanor could see he wasn't really reading anymore. The fire crackled, the wind whispered against the windows, and in the warm circle of lamplight, two people who'd been alone too long sat in the kind of silence that wasn't empty at all, but full of possibility and danger and the fragile hope that sometimes mercy could save more than just a life. The days that followed fell into a pattern that felt almost like contentment. They worked together in the mornings, fixing things around the ranch, tending the animals, preparing for the spring that would eventually come. Caleb's strength returned more each day, and with it came a quiet confidence. He moved around the property like he belonged there, finding tasks that needed doing and doing them without being asked. Eleanor caught herself watching him sometimes, the way he split wood with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice, the way he talked to the horses in the barn, his voice low and soothing, the way he'd taken to wearing Samuel's hat when he worked outside, pulling it low against the glare of sun on snow. It should have bothered her more than it did, seeing another man wear Samuel's things, occupy Samuel's space. But somehow it didn't. Maybe because Caleb wasn't trying to replace anyone. He was just trying to be useful, to earn his keep, to repay a debt he felt he owed. One afternoon, Eleanor came in from checking the henhouse to find Caleb at the table, writing. He looked up when she entered, his expression sheepish. "Sorry," he said, starting to close the journal he'd been writing in. "I found this in the shelf. Thought it was blank." "It is blank," Eleanor said, hanging up her shawl. "Samuel bought it for me years ago, thinking I'd keep a diary. I never did. You're welcome to use it." He hesitated, then nodded his thanks and went back to writing. Eleanor busied herself with starting dinner, but her curiosity was piqued. What was he writing? Letters? Testimony? Or just thoughts he needed to put down before they ate him alive? She didn't ask. Privacy was one of the few luxuries they both still had in this small space. That evening, after they'd eaten and the dishes were cleared, Caleb surprised her by producing a worn harmonica from his pocket. "I found this in my saddlebag," he said, turning it over in his hands. "Managed to save it before my horse died. Been carrying it for years. Would you mind if I played?" Eleanor settled into her chair with her mending. "I'd like that." The music that came from the harmonica was slow and haunting. Old songs mostly, the kind that spoke of loneliness and longing and roads that led nowhere good. But there was beauty in it too, a kind of aching sweetness that made Eleanor's chest tight. She listened with her eyes closed, her hands still on her mending, and for a moment she was young again, sitting on her father's porch while someone played fiddle at a barn dance, before Samuel, before Wyoming, before she learned what it meant to lose everything. When the music stopped, she opened her eyes to find Caleb watching her. "You have tears on your face," he said softly. Eleanor touched her cheek, surprised to find it wet. She wiped at her eyes roughly. "It's nothing. Just reminded me of something good or something sad, both." She smiled, though it wobbled at the edges. "Most memories are, I think." He nodded like he understood, then lifted the harmonica to his lips and played again. Something lighter this time, almost cheerful, and despite herself, Eleanor laughed. "What is that?" she asked. "Irish jig. My mother used to sing it." He played a few more bars, then lowered the harmonica. "Can't remember the words anymore, but the tune stuck." "Play it again," Eleanor said. And he did, and this time she found herself tapping her foot, her mending forgotten in her lap. They stayed up later than usual that night, Caleb playing and Eleanor listening, the cabin filled with music for the first time in 3 years. When they finally said goodnight and went to their separate corners, Caleb to the chair by the fire, Eleanor to her bed in the small room off the main space. She lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Something was changing. She could feel it like the first thaw of spring, like the subtle shift in the air that told you winter was losing its grip. It should have frightened her. This change should have made her want to pull back, to shore up her defenses. But instead, she found herself leaning into it, curious to see where it would lead. Dangerous, she thought. This was dangerous, but she didn't care. The next morning, Eleanor woke to find Caleb already up, standing at the window with his back to her. Something in his posture made her sit up quickly. "What is it?" she asked, her voice still rough with sleep. "Riders," he said quietly. "2 of them, coming up the valley road." Eleanor's blood went cold. She threw back the blankets and joined him at the window, peering out into the gray dawn. Sure enough, 2 dark shapes were moving through the snow, still distant but coming closer. "Could be anyone," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Could be neighbors checking on me after the storm. Could be." But his hand had gone to his side, to where the knife wound was healing. And she knew he didn't believe it any more than she did. They stood there together, watching the riders approach, and Eleanor felt the fragile peace of the past 2 weeks begin to crack. Whatever was coming, whoever those men were, the world outside had finally caught up to them. The easy days were over. The riders were still a quarter-mile away when Caleb stepped back from the window. "I should go," he said. "If they're Blackwood's men, we don't know that they are. And if they are, you want to be found harboring a fugitive?" Eleanor turned to face him, her jaw set. "You're not a fugitive. You're a guest in my home, and I don't run from my own property because 2 strangers are riding up the road. Eleanor." "No." Her voice was firm. "We do this together. We see who they are and what they want, and if they're here for you, then we deal with it. But I'm not hiding you in the barn like some criminal. You've done nothing wrong. You don't know that. I know enough." She moved to the shelf and took down Samuel's rifle, checking to make sure it was loaded. She'd cleaned it just last week, more out of habit than expectation she'd need it. Now she was grateful for the habit. "Get your gun. We'll face them together." Caleb stared at her for a long moment, something complicated moving across his face. Gratitude and fear and something that might have been admiration. Then he nodded and went to retrieve his revolver from where she'd cleaned and stored it that first night. By the time the riders reached the cabin, Eleanor and Caleb were standing on the porch, she with the rifle held loosely at her side, he with his hand resting on the gun at his hip. Professional, ready, united. The 2 men reined in their horses about 20 feet from the porch. They were rough-looking, dressed in heavy coats and hats pulled low. One was older, with a gray beard and hard eyes. The other was younger, nervous, his hand twitching near his gun belt. The older one spoke first. "Morning, ma'am. We're looking for a man." "I'd have passed this way about 2 weeks ago, during the storm." Eleanor kept her face neutral. "What's your business with?" "That's between us and him, ma'am. You seen anyone?" "I've seen a lot of people in my time," Eleanor said coolly. "You'll have to be more specific." The younger one shifted, in his saddle impatient. "Don't play games, lady. You got him in there or not?" "Boy," the older one said sharply, then looked back at Eleanor. "Apologies for my associate. We're working for Mr. Blackwood. The man we're looking for stole from him. We just want to bring him back to answer for it." "Stole what?" Eleanor asked. "Papers, documents, things that don't belong to him." Beside her, Eleanor felt Caleb tense. She didn't look at him, kept her eyes on the riders. "Well," she said evenly, "I haven't seen anyone matching that description. Storm was bad. If someone tried to ride through it, likely they're dead somewhere between here and town." The older man studied her, his eyes sharp. Then his gaze shifted to Caleb, and Eleanor saw recognition flicker across his face. "That's your husband, ma'am? That's none of your concern. Looks familiar." The man leaned forward in his saddle, squinting. "Real familiar." Caleb's hand tightened on his gun. Eleanor could feel the tension radiating off him, could sense how close they were to violence. She stepped forward slightly, drawing the rider's attention back to her. "I think it's time you gentlemen moved along," she said, her voice cold as the snow around them. "This is private property, and you're not welcome here." The younger one's hand dropped to his gun. "Now listen here." "No, you listen." Eleanor raised the rifle, not quite pointing it at them, but making her intentions clear. "I've been polite. I've answered your questions. Now I'm telling you to leave. If Mr. Blackwood has a problem with that, he can take it up with the marshal." For a long moment, nobody moved. The world seemed to hold its breath, balanced on the edge of something terrible. Then the older man smiled. A thin, dangerous thing that didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, ma'am," he said softly. "We'll be going. But we'll be back. And next time, we'll bring the marshal with us. Make sure everything's proper." He wheeled his horse around, and the younger one followed. They rode off the way they'd come, not hurrying, but not lingering either. Eleanor and Caleb stood on the porch, watching until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did Eleanor lower the rifle. Only then did she let out the breath she'd been holding. "They know," Caleb said, his voice tight. They recognize me, maybe Eleanor. He turned to her, his face drawn. They're going to come back, with more men, with the marshal. And when they do, we'll tell the truth. She looked at him steadily. That you came here wounded, that I gave you shelter, that you've broken no laws I'm aware of. Let them prove otherwise. And if they can, then we face that when it comes. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Not a storm, but the promise of one. The sky had darkened while they'd been confronting the riders. Clouds moving in from the west. Another blizzard maybe, or just winter reminding them it wasn't finished yet. Caleb reached out and touched her arm, just briefly, just enough that she felt the warmth of his hand through her sleeve. Thank you, he said quietly, for standing with me. Eleanor met his eyes and saw everything she'd been trying not to see for the past 2 weeks. The gratitude, yes, but also the fear, the loneliness, the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd found a place worth staying for, worth fighting for. Come on, she said, stepping back inside. Let's get some breakfast. We're going to need our strength for whatever comes next. They ate in silence, both of them lost in thought. Outside, the wind began to pick up, and the first flakes of snow started to fall. By afternoon, it would be another whiteout. By evening, the valley would be cut off from the world again. But this time, Eleanor wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse, because the men from Bitter Creek would be back. And when they came, the fragile piece she and Caleb had built in this cabin would shatter like ice under a hammer. She looked across the table at him, at this man who'd become more than a stranger, who'd somehow become necessary in ways she didn't fully understand. And she thought about the letter in his coat, about the name Henry Blackwood, about justice and mercy and the price both demanded. Outside, the storm closed in, and the world disappeared into white. But inside, by the fire, 2 people sat together in the gathering dark, and for now, for this moment, that was enough. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of wind that howled like something wounded, of snow that fell so thick you couldn't see the barn from the cabin door. 3 days of being trapped inside with nothing to do but wait and wonder when the men would return. Eleanor and Caleb moved around each other carefully during those days like dancers who knew the steps but weren't sure of the music anymore. The easy rhythm they'd found before the riders came had been broken, replaced by a tension that made every silence feel heavy, every accidental touch electric with meaning they couldn't name. On the 4th morning, the storm broke. Eleanor woke to sunlight streaming through the window, real sunlight, strong and clear, and knew without looking that the roads would be passable again, which meant the men from Bitter Creek could come back, which meant time was running out. She found Caleb already awake, standing at the window as he so often did now, his hand resting on the frame. He didn't turn when she approached, but she saw his shoulders tense with awareness. They'll come today, he said quietly, or tomorrow. But soon, I know, I should leave, before they get here, before they connect you to me any more than they already have. Eleanor moved to stand beside him, looking out at the white expanse of valley, the distant mountains sharp against the blue sky. And go where? You still don't have a horse. The nearest town besides Bitter Creek is 40 miles through mountain passes that'll be drifted 6 feet deep. You wouldn't make it a day on foot. Better than staying here and bringing trouble down on you. The trouble's already here, Caleb. Has been since that first night. She turned to look at him. We face it together, or we don't face it at all. That's the choice. He finally met her eyes, and she saw the conflict there, the desire to protect her warring with the need to stay, to see this through. You don't owe me anything, he said. I know. I'm not doing this because I owe you. I'm doing it because it's right. Right doesn't always win, Eleanor. Not out here. Maybe not. But I'd rather lose doing what's right than win by turning my back on someone who needs help. She held his gaze. Wouldn't you? He didn't answer, but something in his face softened, resignation maybe, or gratitude, or that complicated mix of both that seemed to define everything between them now. They spent the morning preparing. Not for a fight, exactly, but for confrontation. Eleanor cleaned Samuel's rifle again, loaded it, and set it by the door where she could reach it quickly. Caleb checked his revolver, oiled the mechanism, made sure the bullets were dry and ready. They worked in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, their own fears. By noon, Eleanor had started to hope that maybe the riders wouldn't come, Maybe they decided she wasn't worth the trouble. Maybe they'd found their answers elsewhere. Then she heard the sound of hooves. Multiple horses this time. More than two. Eleanor. Caleb's voice was tight. He was at the window, looking out. 5 riders, and one of them's wearing a badge. Her stomach dropped. She moved to join him, and sure enough, 5 men were approaching up the valley road. She recognized the 2 from before. The older one with the gray beard, the younger nervous one. The other 3 were strangers, hard-looking men with the kind of eyes that had seen violence and not been bothered by it. And riding in the center, on a fine roan horse, was a man wearing a star on his chest. Marshall Dixon. She'd met him twice before, when he'd made his rounds checking on the outlying homesteads. He'd seemed decent enough, fair, if not particularly warm. But he was also the law in this territory, which meant he answered to men like Henry Blackwood, whether he wanted to or not. "Stay calm," Eleanor said, more to herself than to Caleb. "We've done nothing wrong." They don't care about wrong or right. They care about what Blackwood tells them to care about. Eleanor picked up the rifle and opened the door, stepping out onto the porch. Caleb followed a step behind, his hand resting on his gun. The 5 riders reined in at the edge of the yard, their horses stamping and blowing in the cold air. Marshall Dixon rode forward a few paces, separating himself from the others. He was a lean man in his 50s, with a weathered face and gray mustache. His eyes were sharp but not unkind as he looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Pritchard," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I apologize for the intrusion. Marshall." Eleanor kept her voice neutral. "What brings you out this way? These gentlemen," he gestured to the men behind him, "have made some serious allegations. They claim you're harboring a fugitive, a man wanted for theft and assault. They claim wrong," Eleanor said firmly. "I'm harboring a guest, a man who came to my door half frozen during the blizzard 2 weeks ago. I gave him shelter as any Christian would. There's no crime in that." "There is if the man's a criminal," the older rider said, spurring his horse forward. "That's Caleb Thorne, Marshall. He stole documents from Mr. Blackwood. Important documents. We've got witnesses who'll testify to it." "Witnesses Blackwood paid for," Caleb said, his voice cold. "Lies he manufactured to cover his own crimes." The marshal held up a hand. "That's enough. Mr. Thorne, I'm going to need you to come with me, back to Bitter Creek. There'll be a hearing, and you'll have a chance to tell your side." "A hearing in Blackwood's town?" Caleb laughed, a bitter sound. "Where he owns the judge and half the jury. That's not justice, Marshal. That's a lynching with legal paperwork. The law is the law," Dixon said, but his eyes flickered with something that might have been doubt. "You can fight this the right way, or you can fight it the wrong way. But either way, you're coming with me." "No," Eleanor said, stepping forward. "He's not." Every eye turned to her. She felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing, pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. But she kept her chin up, her grip steady on the rifle. "Mrs. Pritchard," the marshal said carefully, "I don't want any trouble here. Neither do I, but I'm not going to stand by and watch you drag an innocent man off to face false charges." She looked past him to the older rider. "You work for Blackwood. Everyone knows it, and everyone knows what Henry Blackwood does to people who cross him. He doesn't want justice. He wants Caleb dead, because Caleb knows things that could destroy him." "That's slander, ma'am," the older rider said, his voice hard. "It's truth, and you know it." The younger rider's hand dropped to his gun. "Maybe we should just take him, Marshal. Woman's clearly not thinking straight. You touch that gun, boy, and you'll be the first one bleeding," Eleanor said, her voice like ice. She raised the rifle slightly, not quite pointing it, but making her intentions clear. "I've buried one husband. I'm not afraid of burying more men if I have to." "Eleanor," Caleb touched her arm, "don't do this. I'm not letting them take you. You don't have a choice." He looked at her, and his eyes were full of something that broke her heart, resignation and gratitude and a sadness so deep it seemed to have no bottom. "They've got the law on their side, and you've got a life here, a home. I won't let you throw that away from me. Caleb, please." His hand tightened on her arm. "Let me go." For a long moment Eleanor stood frozen, torn between what was right and what was survivable. Then one of the other riders, a man with a scarred face and dead eyes, spat into the snow. "Enough talk," he said. "Marshal, we taking him or not?" Dixon's jaw tightened. "We're taking him. Mr. Thorne, I'm going to have to ask you to surrender your weapon. Caleb's hand moved away from Eleanor's arm, hovering over his gun. The tension in the yard stretched tight as wire, ready to snap. Eleanor could feel it in the air, could see it in the way the riders' hands drifted toward their weapons, in the way Caleb's body had gone still and ready. This was the moment where someone made a choice, and people lived or died because of it. Don't, Eleanor said quietly, looking at Caleb. Don't make me watch you die here. He looked at her, really looked at her, and something passed between them. All the words they'd never said, all the feelings they'd been too careful to name. Then slowly, he lifted his hands away from his gun and raised them in surrender. All right, he said, I'll go. The marshal dismounted and moved forward carefully, taking Caleb's gun from his holster and passing it back to one of the riders. Then he pulled out a pair of iron shackles. That's not necessary, Eleanor protested. He's cooperating. Protocol, ma'am. I'm sorry. Dixon's voice was genuinely apologetic as he closed the shackles around Caleb's wrists. The sound of the metal clicking shut felt like a death sentence. Eleanor watched, her hands trembling with rage and helplessness, as they led Caleb toward one of the horses. He moved slowly, carefully, like a man walking to the gallows. When he was mounted, the older rider took the reins, making sure he couldn't bolt. Marshal Dixon turned back to Eleanor. Mrs. Pritchard, I want you to know, I'll do my best to make sure this is handled fairly, but you should prepare yourself. If Blackwood's determined to see this through— I know what Blackwood's determined to do, Eleanor said, her voice shaking. And if you let it happen, Marshal, you're no better than the men who work for him. Dixon's face tightened, but he didn't respond. He just mounted his horse and gathered the reins. Wait. Eleanor moved down the porch steps, ignoring the way the riders tensed. She walked straight to Caleb's horse, looking up at him. This isn't over, she said quietly, so only he could hear. Do you understand me? This isn't over. He looked down at her, and she saw his throat work as he swallowed. Eleanor, whatever they say you did, whatever lies Blackwood tells, I know the truth, and I'll make sure everyone else knows it too. You can't fight him. He's too powerful. Watch me. She reached up and squeezed his leg, the only part of him she could reach. I'm not letting you go that easily, Caleb Thorne. Something flickered in his eyes. Hope, maybe, or fear, or love. He opened his mouth to say something, but the older rider jerked the reins, pulling the horse away. Time to go, he said roughly. Eleanor stepped back, watching as they turned the horses and began riding away. Caleb looked back once, his eyes finding hers across the distance. Then they crested the ridge and disappeared, leaving nothing but hoof prints in the snow. Eleanor stood in the yard long after they'd gone, her arms wrapped around herself, the rifle hanging forgotten at her side. The sun was bright and cold, and the wind had picked up, blowing snow across the tracks the horses had left. Soon even those would be gone, erased by the weather like they'd never been there at all. But Eleanor would remember the look in Caleb's eyes when they'd shackled him, would remember the way his hand had felt on her arm, warm and solid and real, would remember every conversation they'd had, every silence they'd shared, every moment that had built this connection between them. This fragile, dangerous thing that felt like the beginning of something she'd thought she'd never have again. She turned and walked back into the cabin. It felt empty now, hollow in a way it hadn't even after Samuel died. Because when Samuel died, she'd grieved, but she'd also known it was final. Known he wasn't coming back. This was different. Caleb was alive, but he might as well be dead for all the chance he had against Henry Blackwood. Unless she did something about it. Eleanor set the rifle down and moved to the table, where Caleb had left the journal he'd been writing in. She picked it up, her fingers trembling, and opened it. The pages were filled with his handwriting, neat, controlled script that covered page after page. She started reading, and as the words sank in, her breath caught. It was testimony, evidence, names, dates, places, a detailed accounting of Henry Blackwood's crimes, land fraud, intimidation, bribery, even murder, though the proof of that was circumstantial. But there was enough here, more than enough to bring Blackwood down if it ever saw the light of day. This was what he'd been protecting, what he'd nearly died for, what Blackwood's men had tried to take from him, and Caleb had left it here, with her. Eleanor closed the journal, her mind racing. She thought about the marshal, about the look in his eyes when she'd accused him of being in Blackwood's pocket. He hadn't liked it. Hadn't denied it exactly, but hadn't liked it. which meant maybe there was a chance he was the kind of man who'd care about justice if the evidence was strong enough. Or maybe she was a fool for hoping. But hope was all she had now. She tucked the journal into her coat and grabbed Samuel's rifle. Then she went to the barn, saddled her horse, a sturdy mare named Bess who'd carried her through 3 winters, and mounted up. The ride to Bitter Creek would take most of the day, longer if the drifts were bad, but she'd make it. She had to, because she'd made a promise. To Caleb, to herself, to the memory of the woman she used to be before grief and loneliness had worn her down to nothing but survival. She'd told him this wasn't over, and she'd meant it. The valley road was hard going, the snow deep in places where the wind had piled it into drifts. But Bess was sure-footed, and Eleanor pushed her as hard as she dared. The sun climbed higher, then started its descent toward the western mountains. By the time Eleanor reached the outskirts of Bitter Creek, shadows were stretching long across the snow, and the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. The town looked the same as it always did, a collection of wooden buildings hunched against the cold, smoke rising from chimneys, the sound of voices and horses carrying on the frozen air. Eleanor rode straight down the main street, ignoring the curious looks from people who recognized her. The widow from the valley, riding into town alone, that would be gossip by morning. She didn't care. The marshal's office was a small building at the end of the street, next to the general store. Eleanor tied Bess to the hitching post and walked inside without knocking. Marshal Dixon looked up from his desk, surprise flickering across his face. "Mrs. Pritchard, I wasn't expecting—" "Where is he?" Eleanor demanded. "Where's Caleb?" "In the back, locked up." Dixon stood slowly, his eyes moving from her face to the rifle in her hand. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to put that down." Eleanor leaned the rifle against the wall but kept her hand on it. "I need to see him. That's not— I need to see him, Marshal. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." Dixon studied her for a long moment, then sighed. 5 minutes. That's it." He pulled a key from his pocket and led her through a door at the back of the office. The jail was small, just 3 cells, all empty except for the one at the end. Caleb sat on the narrow cot, his head in his hands, the shackles still on his wrists. He looked up when he heard footsteps, and when he saw Eleanor, his entire body went rigid. "What are you doing here?" His voice was rough, almost angry. "Keeping my promise." Eleanor turned to the marshal. "Open the door." "Ma'am, I can't." "Open it, or I'll shoot the lock off myself." She met his eyes steadily. "Your choice, Marshal." Dixon muttered something under his breath but unlocked the cell door. Eleanor stepped inside, and he locked it behind her, then walked back toward the office, giving them what privacy he could. Eleanor moved to sit beside Caleb on the cot. Up close, she could see the strain in his face, the exhaustion in his eyes. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. "I'm in a cell waiting to face charges from a man who wants me dead. How do you think I am?" He shook his head. "You shouldn't have come here. It's not safe. Nowhere's safe anymore." She pulled the journal from her coat and held it out to him. "You left this." He stared at it, then at her. "You read it." "I did. And now I understand why they want you dead." She pressed the journal into his hands. "This is your evidence, Caleb. This is how you fight him. It's not enough. Not in this town. Not against Blackwood." But his fingers closed around the journal, holding it like a lifeline. "Then we take it somewhere else. To the territorial capital. To a federal judge. Somewhere Blackwood doesn't own everyone." Eleanor reached out and touched his face, making him look at her. "You don't give up. Not now. Not after everything." "Eleanor." His voice broke on her name. "Why are you doing this? Why risk yourself for me?" She could have lied, could have said it was about justice, or doing what was right, or simple Christian charity. But sitting there, in that cold cell, with the walls closing in and time running out, she found she couldn't hide behind comfortable lies anymore. "Because I love you," she said simply. "I don't know when it happened, or how. But somewhere between you collapsing at my door and this moment right here, I fell in love with you. And I'm not going to stand by and watch them destroy you." Caleb stared at her, his eyes wide with shock. Then, slowly, carefully, he lifted his shackled hands and cupped her face. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. "Don't deserve this. Maybe not. But you have it anyway." She covered his hands with hers. "So what are we going to do about it?" Before he could answer, they heard shouting from the front office. Loud voices, angry, getting closer. Eleanor stood quickly, and Caleb rose with her, his body tensing for a fight. The door to the cells burst open, and 3 men strode through. Eleanor recognized the older rider from Blackwood's crew, along with the scarred man, and another she hadn't seen before, tall, well-dressed, with cold eyes and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. Henry Blackwood himself. "Well, well," Blackwood said, his voice smooth as oil. "The widow and the thief, how touching." His eyes moved over Eleanor with a look that made her skin crawl. "Mrs. Pritchard, I don't believe we've been formally introduced. I'm Henry Blackwood." "I know who you are," Eleanor said coldly. "Then you know I'm not a man to be trifled with." He turned his attention to Caleb. "You've caused me a great deal of trouble, Mr. Thorne, stealing my property, running like a coward, and now involving this poor woman in your schemes. The only schemer here is you," Caleb said, "and everyone in this room knows it." Blackwood smiled, a thin, dangerous expression. "Careful, Thorne. You're in enough trouble already. Don't make it worse." He pulled a folded document from his coat and held it up. "I have here a signed confession from a witness who saw you break into my office and steal confidential documents. The judge has already issued a warrant. Your trial is set for tomorrow morning." "A trial you've already decided," Eleanor said. "A confession you paid for. This isn't justice." "No, Mrs. Pritchard. This is business." Blackwood's eyes hardened. "And I'd advise you to stay out of it, unless you want to find yourself facing charges as well. Aiding and abetting a criminal. That's a serious offense. So is fraud. And murder." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "Caleb has evidence against you. Testimony that will destroy you. And if anything happens to him, that evidence goes straight to the territorial governor." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Blackwood's face. "What evidence? Names, dates, every crime you've committed for the past 5 years. Eleanor was bluffing. She left the journal hidden back at the cabin, not trusting it to survive the ride to town. But Blackwood didn't know that. You touch him, and your empire burns. Blackwood's jaw tightened. "You're lying." "Am I?" Eleanor smiled, cold and hard. "There's only one way to find out. Go ahead, kill him, and see what happens." The silence in the cell was absolute. Blackwood stared at her, his mind clearly working through the possibilities. Then Marshal Dixon appeared in the doorway, his hand resting on his gun. "Mr. Blackwood," he said carefully, "I think it's time you left. The prisoner's in my custody, and I'll handle this by the book." "Your book or mine, Marshal?" Blackwood asked softly. Dixon's face flushed. "The law's book. Now get out of my jail." For a moment Eleanor thought Blackwood would refuse, thought he'd order his men to shoot, consequences be damned. But then he smiled that cold smile and tucked the document back into his coat. "Of course, Marshal, we'll do this properly." He looked at Caleb one more time. "See you in court, Mr. Thorne. I do hope you've made peace with your maker." He turned and walked out, his men following. The sound of their boots echoed down the hall, then faded as the front door opened and closed. Eleanor let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Her legs felt weak, and she had to sit down on the cot before they gave out. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen," Caleb said quietly, "or the most foolish. Probably both." She looked up at him, at this man she'd somehow come to love, and felt tears burning behind her eyes. "Caleb, I don't know how to stop this. I don't know how to save you." He sat beside her, his shackled hands reaching for hers. "You already have," he said, "just by being here, by believing in me when no one else would. That's more than I ever expected, more than I deserve. You deserve so much more than this." She leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder, and felt him press his face into her hair. "I wish we had more time. We'll get more time," he said, but his voice was hollow. They both knew the truth. Tomorrow there would be a trial. Tomorrow Blackwood would make sure Caleb was convicted. And tomorrow, everything they'd barely begun to build would end before it had a chance to grow. Marshal Dixon appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Pritchard, time's up." Eleanor stood slowly, reluctantly. She looked down at Caleb one more time, trying to memorize his face, the way his eyes looked in the lamplight, the set of his jaw that spoke of determination even in the face of impossible odds. "This isn't over," she said again. "I promise you, this isn't over." He nodded, but she could see he didn't believe her. And maybe he was right not to. Maybe she was just a widow playing at heroism, tilting at windmills that would crush her without a second thought. But she'd made a promise, and she intended to keep it. Eleanor walked out of the cell, out of the jail, into the cold evening air. Behind her, she heard the cell door lock, heard Caleb's soft exhale of resignation. The sound of it broke something in her chest, something that had already been cracked and fragile. She untied Bess and mounted up, turning the horse back toward the valley road. The ride home would be dark and dangerous, but she didn't care. She needed to think, needed to figure out what to do next, because tomorrow they would try to take everything from Caleb, his freedom, his life, maybe even his hope. But they hadn't counted on one thing, a widow who'd learned that love was worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed hopeless, especially then. The stars came out as Eleanor rode, cold and distant and countless. And somewhere in that vast darkness she heard thunder rolling, not from the sky but from deep in the earth, like the sound of something breaking. Something that once broken could never be put back together the same way. She pressed her heels to Bess's sides and rode faster, racing against time and fate and the weight of a world that didn't care about mercy or justice or love. But she cared, and sometimes that was enough to change everything. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She rode through the darkness, the cold biting at her face, her hands numb inside her gloves. Bess was tired, stumbling occasionally in the deep snow, but Eleanor pushed her on. They had to get home, had to get back to the cabin where the journal was hidden, where she could think, where she could figure out what to do next. It was near midnight when she finally saw the dark shape of the cabin against the snow. No smoke rose from the chimney, no light burned in the window. The place looked abandoned, lifeless, and Eleanor felt a sharp pang of loss that took her breath away. This was what her life would be now, she realized. This emptiness, this silence. If Blackwood won tomorrow, and he would win, they both knew he would, Caleb would hang, and Eleanor would be left alone again. More alone than she'd been after Samuel died, because this time she'd know what she was missing. This time she'd tasted something other than survival, and the loss of it would hollow her out. She led Bess into the barn, unsaddled her, rubbed her down with hands that shook from cold and exhaustion. The mare deserved better care, but it was the best Eleanor could manage. When the horse was settled, Eleanor walked back to the cabin and went inside. The fire had died hours ago. The air inside was nearly as cold as outside. Eleanor stood in the darkness for a long moment, not bothering to light a lamp, just letting her eyes adjust until she could make out the familiar shapes, the table where they'd eaten together, the chair where Caleb had sat reading, the hearth where he'd slept that first week. Every corner of this place held him now. His presence had seeped into the walls, into the floorboards, into the very air. And if he died tomorrow, she'd have to live with these ghosts, would have to wake every morning and remember, would have to cook meals for one, and sleep in a bed that felt too big and watch the snow fall on a valley that had never felt emptier. Eleanor moved to the table and sank into a chair, her body finally giving out. She put her head in her hands and let the tears come, hot and angry and full of a grief that had no outlet because the thing she was grieving hadn't even happened yet. But it would. Tomorrow, or the day after, or the day after that. Blackwood would make sure of it. She cried until there was nothing left, until her throat was raw and her eyes burned and her chest ached with the weight of it all. Then she lifted her head, wiped her face roughly with her sleeve, and made herself think. There had to be something she could do, some way to fight this. She thought about the journal, about the evidence Caleb had gathered. It was damning, more than enough to destroy Blackwood if it reached the right people. But who were the right people? The marshal had shown a flicker of conscience, but he was still just one man in a town Blackwood owned. The territorial governor was in Helena, hundreds of miles away, and by the time a letter reached him, Caleb would already be dead. Unless she went herself, rode to Helena, delivered the evidence personally. But that would take weeks, and she didn't have weeks. She had hours. Eleanor stood and paced the small cabin, her mind racing. There had to be another way. Had to be someone in Bitter Creek who wasn't in Blackwood's pocket. Someone with enough authority or influence to at least delay the trial. Give her time to get help from outside. The circuit judge. He came through every few months, presiding over cases that needed a neutral authority. When was he due next? Eleanor tried to remember, rifling through her memories of conversations in town, bits of gossip she'd half listened to. March, someone had said. The circuit judge would be through in March, but it was only February, still weeks away. She stopped pacing and stood at the window, looking out at the moonlit snow. In the distance she could see the dark shapes of the mountains, jagged against the star-filled sky. Somewhere beyond those mountains was help. Justice. a world that didn't belong to Henry Blackwood, but it might as well be on the moon for all the good it did her now. Eleanor pressed her forehead against the cold glass and closed her eyes. She thought about Caleb sitting in that cell, waiting for a dawn that would bring nothing but mockery of justice. She thought about the way he'd looked at her when she'd told him she loved him, that moment of pure shock followed by something that looked like wonder. She thought about all the things they'd never have a chance to say, all the moments they'd never get to share, and she thought about Samuel, about the promise she'd made at his grave, that she'd keep going, keep fighting, keep living, even when it felt impossible. She'd kept that promise for 3 years, grinding through each day with nothing but stubborn will, and now, when life had finally given her a reason to want more than just survival, it was being ripped away. "No," she said aloud, her voice fierce in the silent cabin. No. She wouldn't accept this. Wouldn't let Blackwood win, even if it meant standing alone, even if it meant risking everything she had left. Eleanor moved to the shelf and took down a piece of paper, one of the few precious sheets she kept for important correspondence. She sat at the table, lit a lamp with trembling hands, and began to write. The letter was addressed to the territorial governor. In it, she laid out everything: Blackwood's crimes, Caleb's evidence, the sham trial that was about to take place. She wrote with desperate clarity, choosing each word carefully, knowing this might be her only chance to make someone listen. When she finished, she folded it, sealed it with wax, and addressed it in her best handwriting. It wouldn't arrive in time. She knew that. But at least if something happened to her, if Blackwood decided she was too much trouble to leave alive, there would be a record. Someone would know the truth. She tucked the letter into her coat, then retrieved the journal from its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard. She held it for a long moment, feeling the weight of it, the importance of what it contained. Then she wrapped it carefully in oilcloth and tucked it into her saddlebag along with the letter. If she was going to do this, she'd do it right. Dawn came cold and gray, the sun hidden behind thick clouds that promised more snow. Eleanor dressed in her warmest clothes, loaded Samuel's rifle, and saddled Bess again. The mare looked at her reproachfully, still tired from last night's ride, but Eleanor had no choice. She pressed her face against the horse's neck for a moment, breathing in the warm scent of her. "I'm sorry, girl," she whispered. "Just one more time. That's all I'm asking." The ride back to Bitter Creek took most of the morning. The wind had picked up, blowing snow across the road in ghostly waves. Eleanor kept her head down and pushed forward, her mind turning over plans and possibilities, discarding each one as impossible, or too dangerous, or simply too late. By the time she reached town, it was nearly noon. The main street was crowded with people, more than usual. Word of the trial had spread, Eleanor realized. People had come to watch, to see Henry Blackwood's justice dispensed, to witness what happened to men who crossed him. Eleanor tied Bess outside the general store and walked toward the courthouse, a 2-story building at the far end of town that served as town hall, courtroom, and meeting place. The crowd was thick around the entrance, people jostling for position, their voices excited and ugly with the anticipation of spectacle. She pushed through them, ignoring the stares and whispers. Some people recognized her, the widow from the valley, the one who'd sheltered the thief. Their eyes followed her with curiosity and judgment in equal measure. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Every bench was filled and people stood along the walls craning to see. At the front of the room sat Judge Peterson, a round man with a florid face who everyone knew took his orders from Blackwood. The jury box held 12 men Eleanor recognized: storekeepers, ranchers, a banker. Good men, most of them, but afraid men, men who knew which side their bread was buttered on. And there, in the prisoner's dock, sat Caleb. He looked thinner than he had yesterday, his face pale, his eyes hollow. The shackles were gone from his wrists, but 2 of Blackwood's men flanked him, making it clear he wasn't going anywhere. When he saw Eleanor enter, something flickered across his face. Surprise, then fear, then a desperate plea she understood without words. "Leave. Get out while you can. Don't watch this." But Eleanor didn't leave. She pushed her way to the front and sat on the bench directly behind the prisoner's dock, close enough that she could reach out and touch Caleb's shoulder if she wanted, close enough that he'd know she hadn't abandoned him. Blackwood sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, dressed in an expensive suit, looking every inch the respectable businessman. When his eyes found Eleanor, he smiled, a cold, satisfied expression that made her want to spit. Judge Peterson banged his gavel, calling for order. The crowd settled, their voices dropping to whispers. The judge shuffled some papers on his desk, then looked up.
We're here today to hear the case against Caleb Thorne, charged with theft and trespass. How does the defendant plead?
Caleb stood slowly. His voice when he spoke was steady, but Eleanor could hear the exhaustion underneath. Not guilty, Your Honor. A murmur ran through the crowd. Judge Peterson frowned. Very well. Mr. Blackwood, you may present your case. What followed was a carefully orchestrated performance. Blackwood's lawyer, a slick man from back east, called witness after witness, each telling the same story. They'd seen Caleb break into Blackwood's office, seen him steal documents, seen him flee when confronted. Their testimony was smooth, practiced, identical in all the ways that mattered. Caleb's court-appointed defender, a young man who looked terrified, barely cross-examined them, barely challenged their stories. Eleanor watched with growing fury as the prosecution built its case, brick by brick, lie by lie. When it was the defense's turn, the young lawyer stood and called Caleb to the stand. Eleanor leaned forward, her hands gripping the bench in front of her. Caleb spoke quietly but clearly, explaining that he hadn't stolen anything. He'd taken evidence of crimes Blackwood had committed, evidence that would prove Blackwood was the real criminal here. But when the lawyer asked for this evidence, Caleb hesitated. I don't have it with me, he said. Why not? The judge asked sharply. Because I knew if I brought it here, it would disappear. Or I would. Caleb looked directly at Blackwood. Henry Blackwood has men killed for knowing less than I know. I'm not stupid enough to hand him the only leverage I have. The courtroom erupted. Judge Peterson banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. When the noise finally died down, he glared at Caleb. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Thorne. Do you have any proof? The proof exists, in a safe place. And if I'm convicted here today, if anything happens to me, that proof will be delivered to the territorial governor. Every crime Blackwood's committed, every bribe he's paid, every man he's had killed, all of it. Blackwood stood, his face red with fury. Your Honor, this is outrageous. The man's clearly desperate, making wild accusations. Sit down, Mr. Blackwood, Judge Peterson said, surprising everyone. He turned back to Caleb. Where is this evidence? Caleb's eyes found Eleanor's. She saw the question there, the uncertainty. She gave the smallest nod, and something in his face shifted, determination replacing despair. Ask Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, he said. She can tell you where it is. Every eye in the courtroom turned to Eleanor. She felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing, crushing her, making it hard to breathe. But she stood anyway, her legs shaking, her voice somehow steady. I have it, she said clearly. The evidence Mr. Thorne gathered, I've read it, every page, and he's telling the truth. Henry Blackwood is a criminal, and everyone in this room knows it. The courtroom exploded again, people shouting, some in outrage, some in agreement. Judge Peterson's gavel cracked like gunfire as he tried to restore order. Through the chaos, Eleanor saw Blackwood's face, and the look there made her blood run cold. Pure rage, barely contained. The look of a man who just decided she was a problem that needed to be eliminated. Mrs. Pritchard, the judge said when the noise had died down, do you have this evidence with you? Eleanor hesitated. The journal was in her saddlebag outside with Bess. If she admitted that, Blackwood would have his men retrieve it, and it would disappear before anyone could read it. But if she lied, I do, she said, making her choice. But I'll only show it to a federal authority, not to this court, not while Henry Blackwood has every man here under his thumb. The courtroom erupted again, louder this time. Judge Peterson was shouting, banging his gavel so hard Eleanor thought he might break it. Blackwood was on his feet, his men moving toward Eleanor, and Caleb was trying to get to her, pushing past the guards, his face desperate. Then a voice cut through the chaos like a knife. Everyone sit down and shut up. Marshal Dixon stood in the doorway, his gun drawn, his face hard. Beside him stood another man, older, gray-haired, wearing a badge Eleanor didn't recognize, a federal marshal's badge. The room went silent. The older man walked down the center aisle, his boots clicking on the wooden floor. When he reached the front, he turned to face the crowd. My name is Marshal Thomas Garrett, United States Marshal Service. I'm here investigating allegations of corruption and murder in this territory. His eyes swept the room, landing on Blackwood, allegations that center on Henry Blackwood and his business interests. Blackwood's face had gone pale. This is outrageous. I don't know what lies you've been told. Sit down, Mr. Blackwood. Garrett's voice was cold. "You'll have your chance to defend yourself. In a federal court, in front of a jury that doesn't owe you money." He turned to Judge Peterson. "This trial is suspended pending federal investigation. The prisoner is to be remanded to my custody." Peterson sputtered, but there was nothing he could do. A federal marshal trumped a local judge every time. He banged his gavel weakly. "Court is suspended." The courtroom erupted one more time, but Eleanor barely heard it. She was watching Caleb, watching as Marshal Garrett's men removed him from the dock and led him toward the door. He looked back at her once, and she saw hope in his eyes for the first time in days. But Garrett stopped in front of Eleanor before leaving. "Mrs. Pritchard, I'll need to see that evidence." Eleanor nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She led him outside, through the crowd that was still buzzing with shock and excitement. At the hitching post, she retrieved the journal from her saddlebag and handed it to him with trembling hands. Garrett opened it, scanning the first few pages. His expression darkened with each line he read. Finally, he closed it and looked at her. "Ma'am, do you understand what you've done here today? You've made yourself a target. Blackwood won't let this go. He can't afford to—" "I know," Eleanor said quietly. "I can offer you protection. Keep you in town until we can get this sorted out. It might be weeks, maybe months." Eleanor shook her head. "I have a ranch to run, animals to feed. I can't just abandon it." "Mrs. Pritchard, I'll be fine, Marshal. I've taken care of myself this long. I can manage a while longer." She looked past him to where Caleb stood between two federal deputies watching them. "Just keep him safe, please." Garrett followed her gaze and nodded slowly. "We will. And Mrs. Pritchard, what you did in there, standing up to Blackwood like that, took more courage than most men have. Don't think it'll go unnoticed." He tipped his hat to her and walked away, taking the journal and Caleb with him. Eleanor watched them go, watched until they disappeared around the corner. Only then did she let herself sag against Bess, her legs finally giving out, her whole body shaking with reaction. It was over. For now, at least. Caleb was safe. The evidence was in federal hands. Blackwood's empire was crumbling. But Eleanor knew this wasn't the end. Not really. Men like Blackwood didn't go down without a fight, and she'd just painted a target on her back. She mounted Bess and turned toward home, toward the cabin that suddenly felt like the loneliest place in the world. Behind her, Bitter Creek buzzed with gossip and speculation. Ahead of her, the valley road stretched empty and white, leading back to a life that had become nothing but waiting. Waiting for news. Waiting for justice. Waiting to see if the man she loved would live or die. Waiting. The days that followed blurred together into a gray monotony of survival and fear. Eleanor went through the motions, feeding the chickens, hauling water, keeping the fire burning, but her mind was always elsewhere. In Bitter Creek, where Caleb sat in federal custody. In Helena, where the case against Blackwood was being built. In a future that might never come, where she and Caleb could have the time they'd been denied. No word came. Not for days. Then weeks. March arrived with more snow, then finally grudgingly gave way to the first hints of thaw. The valley began to wake up, ice breaking on the creek, green shoots pushing through the melting snow, birds returning to nest in the barn eaves. Eleanor worked the land, preparing for spring planting. The work was hard, exhausting, but she welcomed it. It kept her hands busy and her mind from spinning in circles of worry and what if. She thought about Caleb constantly, wondered if he was all right, if the federal marshals were treating him well, if he thought about her the way she thought about him. She'd go days without hearing another human voice, and in the silence, she'd replay their conversations in her mind. The sound of his harmonica, the way he'd looked at her when she'd told him she loved him, the touch of his shackled hands on her face. At night, she'd lie in bed and stare at the ceiling, listening to the wind and the settling of the cabin and the terrible crushing weight of her own loneliness. She'd survived 3 years of solitude after Samuel died. Why did it feel so much worse now? Because before, she'd been numb. Grief had hollowed her out until there was nothing left to feel. But Caleb had changed that, had reminded her what it meant to be alive, to want something, to hope for something beyond just making it to the next day. And now that she remembered, the absence of it hurt in ways she'd forgotten were possible. One evening in late March, she heard hoofbeats. Eleanor grabbed the rifle and moved to the window, her heart hammering. A single rider was approaching up the valley road, moving slowly in the fading light. Not Blackwood's men, she realized after a moment. Just one person, alone, riding a gray horse she didn't recognize. As the rider drew closer, Eleanor saw it was a woman, young, maybe 25, dressed in traveling clothes. She dismounted at the porch and called out, "Mrs. Pritchard? My name is Sarah Garrett. I'm Marshal Garrett's daughter. May I speak with you?" Eleanor lowered the rifle and opened the door. "What news?" Sarah Garrett smiled, a tired but genuine expression. "Good news, ma'am. Blackwood's been arrested. The trial's set for next month in Helena. And Mr. Thorne, he asked me to bring you this." She held out a letter. Eleanor took it with shaking hands, staring at her own name written in Caleb's neat script.
"Is he all right?"
she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's well. Anxious to see you, but well." Sarah's smile widened. "He talks about you constantly. Drove my father half crazy asking if we'd heard from you, if you were safe, if someone was checking on you." Eleanor couldn't speak. She just clutched the letter to her chest, feeling tears burning behind her eyes. "I'll leave you to read that, in privacy," Sarah said gently. "But Mrs. Pritchard? Caleb Thorne is one of the bravest men I've ever met, and my father says you're one of the bravest women. I just thought you should know that what you both did, standing up to Blackwood, it's already making a difference. Other people are coming forward now, sharing their stories. You gave them courage." She remounted her horse and rode away, leaving Eleanor standing on the porch with the letter clutched in her hands. The sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of gold and rose. Spring was coming, really coming this time, not just promising, but delivering. Eleanor went inside and sat by the fire to read. The letter was long, page after page of his neat handwriting. He told her about the investigation, about the evidence building against Blackwood, about the federal prosecutors who were confident of a conviction. He told her about the other prisoners he'd met, men whose lives had been destroyed by Blackwood's greed. He told her about the small cell where he slept, and the food they served, and the books the marshal had lent him to pass the time. But mostly, he wrote about her, about the moment she'd stood up in that courtroom and declared she had his evidence, about the courage it must have taken, about how he'd watched her ride away that day in the snow, thinking he'd never see her again, and how the memory of her face had been the only thing keeping him sane in the long weeks since. And at the end, in words that made her heart ache, he wrote, "Eleanor, I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if Blackwood will be convicted, or if I'll ever truly be free of this. But I know that whatever happens, the time I spent in your cabin was the closest I've ever come to peace. You saved my life that night in the storm. But you did more than that. You gave me a reason to want to live, a reason to believe that maybe I deserved a second chance. I love you. I should have said it in that cell when you told me, but I was too afraid, too certain I was about to lose everything. I'm not afraid anymore. Or maybe I am, but I'm saying it anyway. I love you, Eleanor Pritchard. And when this is over, if it's ever truly over, I want to come home. To your valley, to your cabin. To you. If you'll have me, wait for me, please. Yours, Caleb." Eleanor read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and held it to her heart. Outside, the last light was fading from the sky, and the first stars were coming out. She sat by the fire and watched the flames dance, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something that wasn't fear or loneliness or grief. She felt hope, real hope, the kind that hurt because it made you vulnerable, because it gave you something to lose, but also the kind that made you brave, because it gave you something worth fighting for. The season of waiting had begun, and Eleanor Pritchard, who'd survived 3 years of widowhood and a winter that had nearly broken her, would wait as long as it took, because some things, some people, were worth waiting for. The snow kept melting, the days grew longer, and in a cabin in a Wyoming valley, a woman tended her land and watched the horizon, keeping faith with a promise and a love that distance couldn't diminish, waiting for the day when the waiting would finally end. Spring came slowly to the valley, like a promise whispered so quietly you weren't sure you'd heard it right. Eleanor planted wheat in early April, working the fields alone as she had for 3 years. But this time, it felt different. Before, planting had been an act of survival, something to fill the days, to keep the land from going completely fallow. Now, as she walked behind the plow, scattering seed into dark furrows, she found herself thinking about harvest, about autumn, about Caleb standing beside her, watching the wheat turn gold under the September sun. If he came back. When he came back, she corrected herself firmly. She wouldn't let doubt poison this fragile hope. More letters came, carried by the marshal's daughter, or sometimes by the circuit rider who passed through once a month. Each one Eleanor read until she'd memorized every word, until the paper grew soft from handling. Caleb wrote about the trial preparations, about the witnesses the federal prosecutors had found, about the growing certainty that Blackwood would face justice. But he also wrote about smaller things. The way the sunrise looked through his cell window, a book of poetry someone had given him, the dreams he had of the valley and the cabin and her. Eleanor wrote back, though her letters felt inadequate compared to his. She told him about the wheat, about the foal born to her mare Bess, about the way the mountains looked when the snow melted and revealed the dark stone underneath. She told him she was waiting, that she would always wait, that he had a home here whenever he was ready to claim it. She didn't tell him about the nightmares, the ones where Blackwood's men came in the dark, where gunshots echoed across the valley, where she woke gasping with fear that the life she'd dared to hope for would be ripped away before she could touch it. Some things you carried alone. May arrived with warmth and rain. The wheat sprouted, green and tender, pushing through the soil like small miracles. Eleanor spent hours walking the fields, checking for signs of disease or pest damage, pulling weeds, her hands caked with good earth. The work was endless, but satisfying, in a way nothing had been since Samuel died. One afternoon, as she was mending fence near the road, she heard hoofbeats, multiple horses, moving fast. Eleanor's heart jumped into her throat. She grabbed the rifle she kept nearby and moved behind the fence post, watching. 4 riders appeared over the ridge. For a terrible moment she thought it was Blackwood's men, come to make good on their threats. Then she recognized Marshal Dixon in the lead, and her fear shifted to confusion. They reined in at the fence, and Dixon dismounted, his face grave. "Mrs. Pritchard, Marshal." Eleanor didn't lower the rifle. "What's happened?" "Blackwood escaped custody 3 days ago, killed a deputy in the process." Dixon's voice was tight with anger. "Federal marshals have been tracking him, but they lost his trail near Cheyenne. We have reason to believe he might be headed this way." Eleanor's blood went cold. "Here? You testified against him, ma'am. So did Caleb Thorne. Blackwood's a man who believes in revenge." Dixon looked around the valley, his eyes scanning the ridgelines. "He's got nothing left to lose now. His empire's gone, his reputation's destroyed. All that's left is settling scores." "Where's Caleb?" Eleanor asked, her voice sharp with fear. "Is he safe?" "He's with Marshal Garrett, under federal protection. They're bringing him here, actually. Should arrive by tomorrow. Garrett thinks if Blackwood's coming for anyone, he'll come here first, and they want to use that." "Set a trap." Eleanor absorbed this, her mind racing. "You want to use my ranch as bait. We want to protect you, Mrs. Pritchard, and catch a murderer." Dixon met her eyes. "I won't lie to you, it's dangerous. If you want to leave, go stay with someone in town until this is over. No one would blame you." Eleanor looked at her cabin, at the field she'd just planted, at the land she and Samuel had built from nothing. Then she looked back at Dixon and shook her head. "This is my home. I'm not running from it. When will they be here?" "Sunset tomorrow. Garrett's bringing 6 men. We'll post them around the property. Keep watch." Dixon hesitated. "Mrs. Pritchard, there's something else you should know. Caleb Thorne insisted on coming. Garrett tried to talk him out of it, but he wouldn't listen. Said he wouldn't let you face this alone." Something warm bloomed in Eleanor's chest, cutting through the fear. "Of course he did," she said softly. Dixon nodded, then remounted. "We'll have men watching the road starting tonight. If Blackwood shows up before Garrett arrives, we'll know. But keep that rifle close, and don't open your door for anyone you don't recognize." They rode off, leaving Eleanor standing in the field with the wind moving through the young wheat and the weight of what was coming settling over her like a shroud. Blackwood was coming, and when he did, there would be blood. She'd seen enough of violence in her life to know how these things ended. She spent the rest of the day preparing, cleaned the rifle and Samuel's old shotgun, made sure she had plenty of ammunition, brought in extra firewood, filled every container she had with water, locked the barn, moved the chickens into their coop, put Bess and her foal in the small paddock behind the cabin where they'd be safer. By the time night fell, Eleanor had done everything she could think of. She sat by the fire with the rifle across her lap, listening to every sound outside, the wind in the eaves, an owl calling from the barn, the distant howl of a coyote. Every noise made her heart race. Every shadow seemed to move with threat. But the night passed quietly, and when dawn came, gray and cool, Eleanor allowed herself to hope that maybe Dixon was wrong. Maybe Blackwood had run farther, gone somewhere else to hide. Maybe the sound of gunfire shattered the morning. Eleanor grabbed the rifle and ran to the window. In the distance, near the ridge road, she could see riders, 2 of them, racing toward the cabin with more riders in pursuit. Even from here, she could hear the crack of pistols, could see puffs of smoke. Her hands shook as she checked the rifle's load. This was it. Whatever was coming, it was here now. The riders drew closer, and Eleanor's heart nearly stopped when she recognized the horse in the lead, the gray mare from the marshal's stable, and riding her, Caleb. He was bent low over the horse's neck, riding hard, his coat billowing behind him. Behind him rode Marshal Garrett, his gun drawn, firing back at the pursuers. And behind them came 4 men Eleanor recognized from Blackwood's crew, their faces twisted with murderous intent. Eleanor threw open the door and stepped onto the porch, raising the rifle. She didn't have a clean shot. The riders were too far away, moving too fast, Caleb and Garrett too close to the men chasing them. But she could be ready. Could make sure that when they reached the cabin, she'd be there to help. Caleb saw her on the porch and his eyes went wide with alarm. He was shouting something, but the wind and the sound of hoofbeats tore his words away. Garrett was waving at her, his gestures frantic. Get inside, get down, take cover. But Eleanor didn't move. She planted her feet and raised the rifle to her shoulder, sighting down the barrel at the pursuing riders. When they got closer, just a little closer, she'd fire, would make them think twice about this chase. The riders thundered into the yard, Caleb and Garrett braking hard to the left to give Eleanor a clear line of fire. She squeezed the trigger, and the rifle kicked against her shoulder. One of Blackwood's men jerked in his saddle and tumbled backward, hitting the ground hard. The others scattered, taking cover behind the barn and the water trough. Caleb vaulted off his horse and ran for the porch, taking the steps 3 at a time. His face was wild with fear and something else, something fierce and protective that made Eleanor's heart ache, even as gunfire erupted around them. "Get inside!" he shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the door. "Eleanor, get inside now!" They stumbled through the doorway together, and Garrett was right behind them, slamming the door shut and throwing the bolt. Outside, bullets thudded into the wooden walls, shattering a window. Glass sprayed across the floor. "Stay down," Garrett commanded, crouching below the window line and returning fire through the broken window. "Thorne, cover the back. They'll try to flank us." Caleb moved toward the back room, then stopped and turned to Eleanor. His face was pale beneath the dust and sweat, and his eyes held a dozen emotions she couldn't name. "You shouldn't be here," he said roughly. "You should have left. Should have." "I'm exactly where I need to be," Eleanor cut him off. She moved to the other window, breaking out the glass with the rifle barrel, and took up a firing position. "Now get to the back and make sure they don't come through there." He stared at her for a heartbeat longer, then nodded and disappeared into the back room. Eleanor heard the sound of the window being opened, Caleb's voice calling out a challenge to anyone who might be circling around. "How many?" she asked Garrett, who was reloading his gun with quick, practiced movements. "4 when we left town. You got 1, so 3 left. But Blackwood's out there somewhere." Garrett looked at her, his face grim. "He's the dangerous one, Mrs. Pritchard. The others are just hired guns. But Blackwood, he's got nothing left to lose." As if summoned by his name, a voice rang out across the yard. "Thorne, I know you're in there." Eleanor felt Caleb go still in the back room, felt the tension radiating through the cabin like heat. "Come out and face me like a man." Blackwood's voice was ragged, unhinged. "You destroyed everything I built, everything. And for what? Some self-righteous notion of justice?" Garrett caught Eleanor's eye and shook his head sharply. "Don't respond. Don't engage." Eleanor understood. Talking to Blackwood would only give away their positions, make them targets. But Caleb had other ideas. "Your empire was built on blood and lies, Blackwood," he shouted from the back room. "It deserved to fall. And you deserve to hang for what you've done." "Hang?" Blackwood laughed, a wild sound that made Eleanor's skin crawl. "I'll die before I let them put a rope around my neck. But I'm taking you with me, Thorne. You and that widow who thinks she's so righteous." Gunfire erupted again, concentrated on the back of the cabin now. Eleanor heard Caleb return fire, heard him curse as wood splintered near his head. She wanted to go to him, to pull him away from the window, but Garrett caught her arm. "Stay at your position," he said urgently. If they're hitting the back, someone's going to try the front. We need you here. He was right. Even as he spoke, Eleanor saw movement near the barn. One of Blackwood's men darting from cover, making a run for the porch. She raised the rifle, steadied her breathing the way Samuel had taught her years ago, and fired. The man went down, clutching his legs, screaming. The others pulled him back behind the barn, and Eleanor heard angry shouts, curses, the sound of their plans falling apart. "Good shot," Garrett said grimly. The gunfight continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Back and forth, bullets and shouts and the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the cabin. Eleanor's ears rang from the noise, and her shoulder ached from the rifle's recoil. But she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Not while Blackwood's men were out there. Not while Caleb was in danger. Not while her home was under siege. Then, suddenly, the shooting stopped. The silence was almost worse than the gunfire. Eleanor strained to hear, her heart pounding. What were they planning? Were they retreating or preparing for something worse? "Garrett!" Caleb's voice, tight with alarm. "They're going for the barn." Eleanor looked out the window and saw what he meant. Two figures were moving along the fence line toward the barn, crouched low, carrying something. It took her a moment to realize what it was. Torches. "They're going to burn us out," Garrett said, his face going pale. "Force us outside or smoke us out." "The hell they are," Eleanor said. She stood and moved toward the door. "What are you doing?" Garrett grabbed for her, but she shook him off. "That's my barn. My animals are in there." She grabbed the shotgun from beside the door. "I'm not letting them burn it." "Eleanor, no!" Caleb appeared in the doorway from the back room, his face desperate. "You can't go out there. Watch me." She threw open the door and stepped out onto the porch. The two men were at the barn door now, lighting the torches. They turned when they heard her, surprise flashing across their faces. Eleanor raised the shotgun and fired once, the blast deafening in the morning air. One of the torches flew from a man's hand, landing in the dirt. She fired again, and both men scattered, running for cover without their fire. But Eleanor's moment of triumph was short-lived. From behind the water trough, a third figure stood. Tall, well-dressed even in disarray, his face twisted with rage. Blackwood. He raised his gun, aiming directly at Eleanor's chest. Time seemed to slow. She saw his finger tighten on the trigger, saw the hate in his eyes, saw her death written in the morning air. Then Caleb was there. He hit her from the side, his body slamming into hers, driving her off the porch and into the dirt. She heard the gunshot, heard Caleb's sharp intake of breath, felt his weight on top of her suddenly become dead weight. "No!" The scream tore from Eleanor's throat. She scrambled out from under him, her hands finding the warm wet spreading across his back. No, no, no. More gunfire. Garrett on the porch now, his gun blazing. Blackwood going down, his chest blooming red. The other men surrendering, their hands in the air, their faces pale with the sudden understanding that their employer was dead and their cause was lost. But Eleanor didn't see any of it. She only saw Caleb, lying in the dirt, blood pooling beneath him. Caleb. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely touch him. "Caleb, please, look at me." He opened his eyes, those gray eyes that had watched her across the cabin on so many quiet evenings. "Eleanor," he whispered. His hand found hers, gripped it weakly. "Are you hurt?" I'm fine, but you're—" She couldn't finish. Couldn't say the word. Her hands pressed against the wound in his back, trying to stop the bleeding, but there was so much blood. Too much. "Worth it," he breathed. "You're worth it." "Don't you dare," Eleanor said fiercely, tears streaming down her face. "Don't you dare die on me, Caleb Thorne, not now. Not after everything. Not planning on it." He tried to smile, but it came out as a grimace. "But just, in case, need to tell you, tell me later, when you're better, when you're, love you." His voice was fading, his eyes losing focus. "Loved you. From the moment you dragged me out of that storm. I love you too." Eleanor bent over him, her forehead pressed to his. "So you have to stay. You have to fight. Please, Caleb. Please." His hand tightened on hers once, briefly, then went limp. "No!" Eleanor's scream shattered the morning. "No, no, no, somebody help, please!" Garrett was there, kneeling beside her, his hands already working to check Caleb's pulse, to assess the damage. Other men were arriving now, Dixon and his deputies, drawn by the gunfire. They swarmed the yard, securing the surviving attackers, checking on the fallen. But Eleanor only had eyes for Caleb, for the man who'd collapsed at her door in a snowstorm, who'd fixed her fence and played harmonica by the fire, who'd looked at her like she was something precious, who'd taken a bullet meant for her without hesitation. "He's alive," Garrett said, his voice urgent. "But barely. We need to get him inside, stop this bleeding. Do you have medical supplies?" Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. She helped them carry Caleb into the cabin, her hands slick with his blood, her mind screaming with terror. They laid him on the table, and Garrett stripped away his coat and shirt, exposing the wound. The bullet had entered high on the left side of his back, just below the shoulder blade. Exit wound in front, which was good, meant the bullet had gone clean through, but it had done damage, Garrett confirmed grimly. Might have nicked a lung, might have hit an artery. They needed a doctor, and fast. Eleanor worked mechanically, doing what Garrett told her to do, bringing water, clean cloth, whiskey for sterilizing. Her hands moved while her mind reeled, trapped in that moment when she'd heard the gunshot, felt Caleb's weight on top of her, realized what he'd done. He'd saved her life, and it might have cost him his own. Hours passed in a blur of blood and bandages and desperate prayer. The doctor from Bitter Creek arrived near noon, summoned by one of Dixon's men. He worked over Caleb with grim efficiency, probing the wound, cleaning it, stitching what could be stitched. When he finally stepped back, his face was grave. "He's lost a lot of blood." The bullet missed his heart and his spine, but it did some damage to the lung. "He's breathing, but it's labored. Next 40 to 8 hours will tell the tale." The doctor looked at Eleanor, his eyes kind but honest. "I won't lie to you, Mrs. Pritchard. He might not make it, but he's got a chance. A fighting chance. That's more than most men get." Eleanor nodded, her throat too tight for words. The doctor left medicines and instructions, then rode away with promises to return tomorrow. Garrett and his men secured the property, buried Blackwood and the man Eleanor had shot, and took the surviving attackers into custody. By evening they were gone too, leaving Eleanor alone with Caleb in the terrible waiting. She sat beside him through the night, holding his hand, watching his chest rise and fall with shallow, labored breaths. She talked to him, told him stories about the valley, about the wheat growing in the fields, about the future they'd have together if he'd just hold on, if he'd just fight a little longer. "You promised me time," she whispered as dawn approached. "You said when this was over you'd come home. Well, you're home, Caleb, you're here, so you have to wake up, you have to stay." But he didn't wake, didn't stir, just kept breathing, each breath a fragile thread connecting him to life. The first day passed, then the second. The doctor came and went, changing bandages, checking for infection. "He's holding on," was all he'd say. That's something. Didn't leave Caleb's side except to tend the animals and bring in water. She dozed in the chair beside the table, her hand always on his, her body attuned to every change in his breathing. Neighbors came by with food and offers of help. The marshal's daughter, Sarah, stayed for a day, helping with chores, trying to get Eleanor to rest, but Eleanor couldn't rest, not while Caleb fought for his life, not while the man who'd saved her lay hovering between this world and the next. On the third morning, his fever broke. Eleanor woke to find his hand warm but not burning, his breathing easier. When she checked his pulse, it was stronger. Not strong, but stronger. She let out a sob of relief and pressed her face to his hand, thanking God and fate and whatever force had decided he deserved another chance. That afternoon, his eyes opened. "Eleanor?" His voice was barely a whisper, rough from disuse. "I'm here." She leaned over him, her face wet with tears. "I'm right here. You're crying." He tried to lift his hand to her face but didn't have the strength. "Did we win?" Eleanor laughed through her tears. "We won. Blackwood's dead. His men are in custody. It's over, Caleb. It's finally over. Good." His eyes drifted closed again, but a small smile touched his lips. "Can I sleep now?" "Yes," Eleanor said, kissing his forehead gently. "Sleep. I'll be here when you wake up. I'll always be here." He slept, and this time it was real sleep, healing sleep. Eleanor sat beside him and watched the afternoon light stream through the window, watched the dust motes dance in the golden air, and felt something shift inside her chest. The fear that had gripped her for days was loosening its hold, replaced by a fierce, protective love that took her breath away. This man, this stubborn, brave, foolish man had nearly died to save her, had put himself between her and a bullet without a moment's hesitation, and now he was here, in her cabin, breathing and alive in hers. If that wasn't grace, she didn't know what was. The days that followed were slow and gentle, marked by small victories. Caleb staying awake longer, Caleb eating a little broth, Caleb sitting up with her help, his face pale but determined. The doctor pronounced him out of danger after a week, though he warned it would be months before Caleb was fully recovered. Eleanor didn't care how long it took. She had time now. They both did. One evening, 2 weeks after the shooting, Caleb was finally strong enough to move from the table to the bed. Eleanor helped him walk, his arm around her shoulders, his steps slow but steady. When he was settled against the pillows, he looked at her with an expression that made her heart skip. "What?" she asked, smoothing his blanket. "I keep thinking about what you said, in the courtroom, in front of everyone." His hand found hers. "You told them you loved me, in front of the whole town." Eleanor felt her face warm. "I did. Why? Because it was true. Because I was tired of hiding it. Because—" She met his eyes. "Because love isn't something to be ashamed of, even when the world thinks you're a fool for feeling it." "I don't think you're a fool." His hand tightened on hers. "I think you're the bravest person I've ever met, and I don't deserve you. But if you'll have me, if you'll let me stay here and spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you, I'll do everything in my power to make you happy." "Caleb Thorne, are you proposing to me?" He smiled, a real smile, the first one she'd seen since before the shooting. "I suppose I am, though I'd do it properly, on one knee if I could stand without falling over." Eleanor laughed, a sound full of joy and relief and love. "Then my answer is yes. Yes, I'll have you. Yes, you can stay. Yes to all of it." She leaned down and kissed him, soft and careful, mindful of his injuries. He kissed her back, his good hand coming up to cup her face, his touch gentle and reverent. When they broke apart, Eleanor rested her forehead against his. Outside, she could hear the wind moving through the wheat, the sound like whispered promises, like the land itself was blessing them. "Welcome home," she whispered. "I've been home since the first night," Caleb said. "I just didn't know it until now." They sat together in the fading light, two people who'd been broken by life, and somehow found a way to heal each other. Two people who'd learned that mercy and love were worth fighting for, even when the cost seemed too high. Outside, the valley settled into evening, peaceful and quiet, and inside the cabin, where a stranger had once collapsed in the snow, two hearts beat in time, steady, strong, and finally at rest. The debt had been repaid, the sacrifice acknowledged, and in its wake, grace had bloomed like wheat in good soil, promising a harvest that would last for years to come. Summer came to the valley like a benediction. The wheat grew tall and golden, swaying in warm winds that carried the scent of sage and wildflowers. The mountains stood sharp against blue skies, their peaks still touched with snow that would last until August. And in the cabin by the creek, two people moved through their days with the quiet contentment of those who'd earned their peace through fire and blood. Caleb's recovery was slow but steady. By late May he could walk without help, though his left arm remained weak and would likely never regain its full strength. The doctor said he was lucky. An inch to the right and the bullet would have severed the artery, an inch lower, and it would have collapsed his lung completely. As it was, he'd live, though he'd carry the scar and the ache of it for the rest of his days. Eleanor thought he'd never looked more beautiful. She watched him now from the porch, where she sat shelling peas into a bowl. He was in the field checking the wheat, moving slowly through the stalks, his hand trailing over the grain heads with something like reverence. The afternoon sun caught in his hair, turning the gray to silver, and his face, still too thin, still marked by pain, held an expression of peace she'd never seen there before. He looked like a man who'd finally come home. "You're staring again," Sarah Garrett said from the chair beside her. The marshal's daughter had taken to visiting once a week, riding out from Bitter Creek with news and supplies and a friendship Eleanor hadn't known she needed. "I'm allowed to stare. I almost lost him." Eleanor's hands kept moving, splitting pea pods with practiced ease. "Sometimes I still can't believe he's real. That this is real. It's real." Sarah smiled, her fingers busy with her own bowl of peas. "And the whole territory knows it. Do you know what people are saying about you two? I try not to listen to gossip. They're calling it a miracle. The widow who saved a stranger and found love. The man who nearly died and came back for her." Sarah's voice was gentle, without a trace of mockery. My father says it's the kind of story people need right now. Something to believe in after Blackwood's ugliness. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, watching Caleb bend to examine something in the wheat, probably checking for rust or smut, problems she'd taught him to recognize. "How is the trial going?" she asked. Blackwood was dead, but his surviving men were facing federal charges in Helena. Almost over. The prosecution rested last week. My father says convictions are certain. Sarah paused. They want Caleb to testify, one more time to seal the case. He'd have to go to Helena. Eleanor's hands stilled on the peas. When? Next month. August at the latest. Sarah touched her arm. He'd only be gone a few weeks, and my father would make sure he's protected, that nothing— It's not the danger I'm worried about. Eleanor set down her bowl and stood, moving to the porch rail. It's asking him to relive it all again, to go back to that world when he's just starting to heal. He's stronger than you think. I know how strong he is. That's not the question. Eleanor watched Caleb start walking back toward the cabin, saw him shade his eyes against the sun to look at her. Even from a distance, she felt the connection between them, that invisible thread that had been forged in storm and trial and blood. The question is whether the law has taken enough from him already. Sarah had no answer for that. They finished shelling the peas in silence, and when Caleb reached the porch, his shirt damp with sweat and his face flushed from exertion, Sarah made her excuses and rode away, leaving them alone. What did Sarah want? Caleb asked, sinking into the chair with a slight grimace. His ribs still ached when he moved too much, though he tried to hide it. To tell us the trial's almost finished. They want you to testify. Eleanor sat beside him, taking his hand. You don't have to go. Yes, I do. His voice was quiet but firm. Those men need to face justice for what they've done, and if my testimony helps ensure that, then I owe it. To myself, to everyone Blackwood hurt. You don't owe anyone anything, Caleb. You've paid enough. He turned to look at her, his gray eyes serious. Eleanor, I spent 3 years running from my past, hiding from what I knew, trying to pretend I could just disappear and it wouldn't matter. It took nearly dying to understand that some things you can't run from. Some debts you have to pay, not because anyone's forcing you, but because it's the only way to be free of them. Eleanor understood what he meant, but that didn't make it easier. Then I'm coming with you. Eleanor, don't argue. If you're going back to face that, you're not doing it alone. She squeezed his hand. We're in this together now. That's what together means. He stared at her for a long moment, then pulled her close, pressing his face into her hair. What did I do to deserve you? He murmured. You bled for me, Eleanor said simply. That tends to make an impression. He laughed, a sound that still came rarely but was growing more frequent as the weeks passed. They sat together on the porch, watching the sun sink toward the mountains, and Eleanor felt a fierce gratitude for this moment, this peace, this life they were building one day at a time. The wedding came first, before the trip to Helena. It was a small affair held in the valley on a Sunday morning in July. The circuit preacher performed the ceremony under the cottonwood trees by the creek, with Sarah as witness and Marshal Garrett to give Eleanor away, a gesture that made her eyes sting with unexpected emotion. A handful of neighbors attended, people who'd heard the story and wanted to be part of it, people who understood that love earned through suffering was worth celebrating. Eleanor wore a dress she'd made herself from fabric Sarah had brought from town, simple blue calico that matched the summer sky. Caleb wore Samuel's old suit, altered to fit his frame, and when he saw Eleanor walking toward him through the grass, his face transformed with a joy so pure it made her breath catch. The preacher spoke about covenant and mercy, about the mysterious ways providence worked in the world. He spoke about Ruth and Naomi, about loyalty born of tribulation, and when he asked if they promised to love each other through all the days of their lives, both answered without hesitation, I do. Caleb's hand shook when he slipped the ring onto Eleanor's finger, a simple gold band they'd ordered from the catalog, nothing fancy but solid and real. Eleanor's voice broke when she said her vows, overcome by the impossibility of this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been alone, convinced her life would be nothing but survival until she died. Now she stood beside a man who'd chosen her, who'd fought for her, who looked at her like she was the answer to every question he'd ever asked. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the preacher said, smiling. You may kiss your bride. Caleb cupped Eleanor's face in his hands, his touch gentle, his eyes holding hers for a heartbeat before he leaned in and kissed her. It was soft and sweet and full of promise, A kiss that tasted like hope and new beginnings and all the tomorrows they'd almost lost. The small gathering cheered, and Eleanor laughed against Caleb's mouth, feeling lighter than she had in years, maybe ever. They celebrated with a meal Eleanor and Sarah had prepared: roasted chicken, fresh bread, early vegetables from the garden, and a cake that Sarah's mother had baked and sent along. People ate and talked and told stories as the afternoon stretched long and golden. Marshal Garrett shared tales of the investigation that had brought down Blackwood's network, revealing corruption that reached farther than anyone had suspected. The circuit preacher spoke about other couples he'd married, other love stories he'd witnessed in this hard country. And through it all, Eleanor and Caleb sat side by side, their hands clasped beneath the table, barely able to look away from each other. When the guests finally departed, and the sun began to set, Caleb took Eleanor's hand and led her to the porch. "There's something I need to show you," he said. He pulled a folded document from his pocket and handed it to her. Eleanor unfolded it, her eyes scanning the legal language, struggling to make sense of the words. Then she understood, and her breath stopped. It was a deed. To land adjoining her property, 40 acres of Good Valley land with water rights and timber, and it was made out in her name. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Where did this come from? From me? From the settlement?" Caleb's voice was quiet. When the federal government seized Blackwood's assets, they compensated some of his victims. People he'd cheated, land he'd stolen. I was one of them. They offered me money, but I asked for land instead. This land. The parcel that borders your property to the north. Eleanor stared at the deed, her hands trembling. "Caleb, this is too much. It's not nearly enough." He turned her to face him, his hands on her shoulders. "Eleanor, you saved my life. You gave me shelter when I had nothing, defended me when everyone else wanted me dead. You stood up to Blackwood in that courtroom, risked everything for me. This land, it's not payment. You can't pay for something like that, but it's a symbol. Proof that what you gave me mattered, that mercy has weight in this world. You didn't have to do this. I know, but I wanted to." He gestured toward the valley, toward the wheat fields and the mountains beyond. "I want to build something here with you, Eleanor. Not just a marriage, but a legacy. A place where people will remember that once a widow showed kindness to a stranger, and it changed everything." Eleanor looked at the deed again, then at the land it represented, 40 acres that would double the size of their ranch, give them room to grow, to build, to thrive. She thought about the future spreading out before them like the valley itself, wide and full of possibility. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For this, for everything. Thank you for saying yes." Caleb pulled her close, and they stood together on the porch as darkness fell, watching the first stars come out over the mountains. "For saying yes to a half-frozen stranger on your doorstep. For saying yes when I asked you to wait. For saying yes today when you could have chosen an easier life with a better man. There is no better man," Eleanor said fiercely. "Don't you dare think otherwise." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and when they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. "Come inside, Mrs. Thorne," he said, his voice rough. "Let me show you properly how grateful I am." Eleanor laughed and let him lead her into the cabin, into the life they'd chosen together, into a future that was finally theirs. They left for Helena in early August, traveling with Marshal Garrett and a small escort. The journey took 4 days, and though Caleb tired easily and his old wound ached from the long hours in the saddle, his spirits remained good. He told Eleanor stories as they rode, about his childhood in Ohio, about the war he'd fought in, about the years he'd spent drifting before landing in Blackwood's employ. "I thought I could outrun my conscience," he said one evening, as they camped beneath the stars. "Thought if I just kept moving, I wouldn't have to face what I'd become. But you can't outrun yourself. Eventually, you have to stop and look in the mirror." "And what did you see?" Eleanor asked, lying beside him in their bedroll, her head on his shoulder. "A coward, a man who'd chosen the easy path even when he knew it was wrong." He was quiet for a moment. "But then I saw you, and I thought maybe I could be the kind of man who deserves someone like you, if I was brave enough to try. You are that man, Caleb. You always were. You just had to find your way back to him." The trial in Helena was everything Eleanor had feared. Long days in a stuffy courtroom, listening to testimony about murder and fraud and corruption. Caleb took the stand on the third day, and Eleanor sat in the gallery watching as he recounted everything he'd witnessed, everything he'd documented. His voice never wavered, though she could see the cost and the tightness of his jaw, the way his hand occasionally pressed to his ribs where the scar still pulled. The defense attorneys tried to discredit him, painting him as a disgruntled employee, a man with a grudge. But Caleb had the journal, had the evidence, had names and dates and documentation that couldn't be denied. By the time he stepped down from the witness stand, even the most skeptical jurors looked convinced. The verdict came a week later, guilty on all counts. Blackwood's surviving associates would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison. The courtroom erupted in applause, and Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, not just for the justice served, but for the weight she could see lifting from Caleb's shoulders. It was over. Finally, truly over. They stayed in Helena for a few more days, long enough to see the sentences handed down, long enough to meet with the federal prosecutor who thanked Caleb for his courage. Then they began the journey home, and with each mile that passed, Eleanor felt Caleb relax a little more, the tension that had lived in his body for so long finally beginning to ease. "How does it feel?" she asked as they crested the ridge that looked down into their valley. "To be done with it all?" Caleb reined in his horse, staring down at the cabin, at the wheat fields gone golden in the August sun, at the mountains standing guard over it all. "Like waking up from a nightmare," he said quietly. "Like I can finally breathe." Eleanor reached over and took his hand. "Then let's go home." They rode down into the valley together, and when they reached the cabin, everything was as they'd left it. The chickens scratching in the yard, Bess and her foal in the paddock, the wheat ready for harvest. But somehow it looked different to Eleanor now, not just a place of survival, but a place of joy. A home in the fullest sense of the word. The years that followed were good ones. They harvested the wheat that first autumn, working side by side in the fields, laughing when Caleb's inexperience led to mistakes, celebrating when the grain proved as abundant as Eleanor had hoped. They sold it in town for a good price, and with the money they bought more chickens, repaired the barn, invested in the future they were building together. Caleb proved to be a quick study, learning the rhythms of ranch life with the same determination he'd shown in everything else. He couldn't do the heavy work, his injury had seen to that, but he was clever with solutions, finding ways to accomplish tasks that didn't require the strength he'd lost. He built a system of pulleys to help with the haying, designed a better layout for the chicken coop, taught himself to work leather, and soon every neighbor within 20 miles wanted him to make their tack and harnesses. Eleanor watched him bloom like the valley in springtime, watched him shed the last remnants of the haunted man who'd collapsed on her doorstep and become someone new, someone whole. He laughed more, smiled more, played his harmonica in the evenings while she sewed. He talked about the future without fear, made plans that stretched years ahead, spoke about children they might have, about the ranch they'd pass down to them. And Eleanor loved him more with each passing day, loved him in ways she hadn't known were possible, in the quiet moments and the hard work and the simple grace of waking beside him every morning. People came to know their story. Travelers passing through would sometimes stop, asking if this was the place, the ranch where the widow had saved the stranger. Eleanor always invited them in for coffee, and Caleb would tell the tale, never embellishing, just the simple truth of it. And invariably, people would leave with something in their eyes that looked like hope. Like maybe mercy still mattered in this hard world. Like maybe kindness still had power. 5 years after that first night in the storm, Eleanor stood on the porch watching the sunset and counting her blessings. The ranch was thriving. They'd expanded onto the new land, built a second barn, increased their herd. Their reputation for quality stock and Caleb's leatherwork had spread, bringing business from as far as Cheyenne. They weren't rich, but they were comfortable in a way Eleanor had never expected to be. But more than that, she was happy. Deeply, thoroughly happy in a way that had nothing to do with money or success and everything to do with the man walking toward her from the fields, his face weathered by sun and wind, his smile lighting up at the sight of her. "Wheat's looking good this year," Caleb said, climbing the steps to join her. He moved more slowly now than he had at 35, the old wound making itself known when the weather turned cold, but he didn't complain, just accepted it as the price he'd paid for this life. "Best crop yet, I'd say." "You say that every year, and I'm right every year." He pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly, resting her head against his chest where she could hear his heartbeat, steady, strong, alive. I was thinking, dangerous occupation. He laughed and kissed the top of her head. I was thinking we should have a gathering this autumn, after harvest. Invite the neighbors, the people who've helped us over the years. Celebrate what we've built here. Eleanor lifted her head to look at him. That's a lovely idea. What's the occasion? Do we need one? Can't we just celebrate being alive, being together, having more than we ever dreamed we'd have? His hand came up to cup her face. 5 years ago, I was dying in the snow. Now I'm standing here with you, watching the sun set on land we own, making plans for a future I never thought I'd see. That seems worth celebrating. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, happy tears, the kind that came from a heart too full to contain what it held. Yes, she said, let's do that. Let's celebrate. The gathering happened in late September, after the wheat was in and before the first hard frost. They set up tables in the yard, and people came from miles around, neighbors, friends, the marshal and his daughter, the circuit preacher, even some folks from town who'd heard the story and wanted to be part of it. There was food and music and laughter, children running through the fields, women sharing recipes, men talking about weather and crops and the price of cattle. And in the middle of it all, Eleanor and Caleb moved among their guests, making sure everyone had enough to eat, that every hand was shaken, every story heard. They were the center of their own small constellation, and the love and respect people showed them was almost overwhelming. As evening fell and lanterns were lit, Marshal Garrett stood and called for quiet. I want to say something, he announced, about these two people who've welcomed us into their home. Eleanor felt Caleb's hand find hers, squeezing gently. 5 years ago, Garrett continued, I met Caleb Thorne under the worst possible circumstances. He was a fugitive, accused of crimes, running for his life. And I met Eleanor Pritchard as the woman who'd sheltered him, who'd risked everything to give him a chance at justice. I thought I was dealing with a criminal and a fool. He paused. I was wrong about both of them. A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. What I learned is that courage comes in many forms. Sometimes it's standing up to evil men like Blackwood. But sometimes it's simpler than that. Sometimes it's just opening your door when someone needs help. Choosing mercy when the world says you should choose safety. Believing in someone when everyone else has given up on them. Garrett raised his glass. Caleb and Eleanor Thorne showed us all what that looks like. They showed us that kindness matters, that mercy has power, that love, real love, the kind that costs you something, can change the world. So I propose a toast to the Thornes and to the land that remembered kindness. To the Thornes. The crowd echoed, raising their glasses. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, and when she looked at Caleb, his eyes were bright with emotion too. They clinked their glasses together, and he leaned close to whisper in her ear, Thank you for everything, for all of this. Thank you for falling at my door. Eleanor whispered back. Best decision I never made, he said, and they laughed together, surrounded by friends, by the life they'd built, by the grace that had carried them through storm and trial into this moment of perfect peace. The years continued to pass, marked by seasons and harvests, by small joys and occasional sorrows. Eleanor and Caleb grew older together, their faces weathering like the mountains around them, their hands growing calloused from work, their hearts growing deeper with each shared experience. They never had children, whether by choice or by chance, Eleanor never said, and Caleb never pressed. Instead, they became the people young couples came to for advice, the ranch where troubled boys were sent to learn discipline and purpose, the place where anyone who needed help could find a meal and a listening ear. Their story became legend in the territory. People wrote it down, embellished it, told it to their children, but at its heart, it remained simple. A widow showed mercy to a stranger, and that mercy changed 2 lives forever. Eleanor never forgot the night Caleb had first fallen at her door, the sound of the storm, the weight of him as she dragged him inside, the fear and uncertainty of those first hours. Sometimes on winter nights when the wind howled, she'd wake from dreams of that moment and reach for Caleb in the darkness, needing the reassurance of his warmth, his breathing, his solid presence beside her. And always, he'd be there. Always he'd pull her close and whisper that he wasn't going anywhere, that she was stuck with him until death and probably beyond. And Eleanor would smile into his chest and let the sound of his heartbeat carry her back to sleep. 20 years after that first night, Eleanor stood in the same spot on the porch where she'd heard Caleb's cry for help. She was older now, her hair gone gray, her hands marked with age and work, but her eyes were bright and her smile came easily, and when Caleb joined her, moving slowly, his limp more pronounced than it had been but still strong, still here, she took his hand and felt the same flutter in her chest she'd felt on their wedding day. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, following her gaze to the wheat fields, to the mountains beyond. "That night," Eleanor said, "when you fell at my door, how terrified I was. How certain I was that helping you was a mistake. Was it?" She turned to look at him, at this man who'd become her whole world. "It was the best thing I ever did," she said simply. "The best thing that ever happened to me." "To us," Caleb corrected, pulling her close. "The best thing that ever happened to us." They stood together on the porch, watching the evening light paint the valley gold. The wheat swayed in the breeze, whispering secrets only the land could understand. And in that moment Eleanor felt the presence of every choice that had led to this place, every act of mercy and courage and love that had woven itself into the fabric of their lives. The land remembered kindness, Garrett had said all those years ago, and he was right. The valley held their story in its soil, in the wheat they'd planted, in the home they'd built. It would remember long after they were gone, remember that once, two people had chosen love over fear, had chosen each other over safety, had chosen to believe that mercy was not weakness but the strongest force in the world. "Come inside," Caleb said softly. "Let's watch the stars from the window." Eleanor let him lead her into the cabin, into the warmth and light, into the life they'd earned through fire and blood and grace. And as she crossed the threshold, she thought about the woman she'd been 20 years ago. Alone, grieving, convinced her life was over. She'd been wrong. It hadn't been over. It had been waiting, waiting for a storm, waiting for a stranger, waiting for the moment when mercy would crack her heart open and let love pour in. The door closed behind them, shutting out the evening chill. Inside, the fire burned bright, and two people sat together in the golden light, their heads bent close, their hands clasped, their hearts beating in time with the ancient rhythm of the land. And the valley kept their story, held it safe, whispered it to anyone who would listen, that here, in this place, mercy had triumphed, that here, in this cabin, love had conquered, that here, on this land, two souls had found each other and built something that would outlast stone and steel and time itself, a legacy not of wealth or power, but of kindness, of courage, of the simple, profound truth that sometimes the most important thing you can do is open your door when someone knocks, reach out your hand when someone falls, and choose love when the world says you should choose fear. The wheat grew, the seasons turned, and the land remembered, as land always does, the story of the widow who sheltered a stranger, and later found her name on his deed of land, written not in ink but in love, not as payment but as promise, not as ending but as beginning. Forever and always, beginning.